The man known to history as Socrates, or Socrates in Greek, was born between 470 and 468 BC in the village of Allopeki, a suburb of the Greek city-state of Athens, which lay just to the southeast of the city walls. Despite the fact that he is one of the undisputed intellectual fathers of Western civilization and one of the most consequential philosophers and thinkers in history, scholars actually know shockingly few biographical details about Socrates for certain. His father, Sophroniscus, was described in some sources as a stonemason or sculptor, and his mother, Phinarete, was said to have been a midwife. At first glance, these details seem to suggest that Socrates had a working-class upbringing, which was probably not the case. As one of the most famous public educators in Athens during his time, Socrates almost certainly received an elite education as a young man. Furthermore, his close friends and colleagues were some of Athens' wealthiest, most prominent, and most influential citizens, something that sounds particularly unlikely for the son of a low-status working-class family, even at the dawn of Athenian democracy. This set of suppositions is just one example of the primary means by which modern scholars have attempted to construct a biography of the historical Socrates. This task has proven difficult and endlessly frustrating for historians because of the relative lack of reliable sources. A major barrier to our understanding of Socrates is that he left behind no writings of his own. All we know of him is what other ancient scholars and chroniclers wrote about him. Some of these sources are considered more reliable than others, although virtually none of them can be considered conclusively authoritative by modern standards for various reasons. A majority of historians tend to treat with greater acceptance the biographical details about Socrates which appear in the dialogues written by Plato and Xenophon, because both of these writers were pupils and friends of Socrates himself. Memories of Socrates would have still been relatively fresh for the people of Athens when dialogues like Plato's Apology and Crito or Xenophon's Memorabilia were first published, roughly 10 to 20 years after his death. It stands to reason that if the biographical accounts of Plato and Xenophon had diverged dramatically from what Athenians remembered of Socrates' conduct, his teachings, or his trial and execution, rebuttals likely would have appeared in the literary and historical record. Plato and Xenophon, therefore, may more accurately represent the historical Socrates than other sources, most of which were written many more decades or even centuries after Socrates died by ancient scholars such as Aristotle, Diogenes Laertius, and Plutarch. All this being said, there is still reason to read the dialogues of Plato and Xenophon with a certain amount of skepticism regarding just how accurately they may have depicted or quoted Socrates. Both writers would have been subject to bias because he was their beloved teacher and mentor, and indeed, their reverence for Socrates' wit and wisdom is readily apparent in these texts. However, it is also possible that these authors may have shaped the words and actions of Socrates for their own rhetorical or literary purposes. This is not to say that either Plato or Xenophon or any other ancient writer, historian or chronicler might have done so with malicious or particularly fraudulent intent. some historians have noted that it was common in the literature of the ancient world to pay tribute to important people, either by crediting them with heroic acts or admirable ideas, or even by writing something in their name. Some writers might even have put their own words into the mouths of more famous, respected, or beloved figures in order to lend legitimacy to their own theses and ideas, which many scholars believe both Plato and Xenophon did in some of their dialogues about Socrates. With all these considerations in mind, attempting to reconstruct the historical Socrates might seem to some like an exercise in futility, since none of the extant sources can be considered reliable by modern standards. Yet, this certainly hasn't hindered historians from trying, and numerous writers and researchers throughout the last 2.5 millennia have continued, in spite of these challenges, to pursue a clearer picture of Socrates. Very little is known about his early life and adolescence, but historians have attempted to reconstruct a picture of it with the scant few details available in the Socratic canon, combined with our historical knowledge of the lives of boys and men in classical Athens. The village of Alopeki, where Socrates was born, was home to roughly 3,000 people, a little more than a third of whom were Athenian citizens. Only free-born Athenian men were eligible for citizenship. The rest of the population of the deme, or village of Alopeki, would have been represented by slaves, women, children, and non-Athenian foreigners, none of whom were eligible for citizenship. The life experiences of Socrates that are known to us indicate that he himself was almost certainly an Athenian citizen. That he attained citizenship himself likely means that his father, Sophroniscus, was also an Athenian citizen. That said, Sophroniscus, as a skilled tradesman, probably did not come from a particularly affluent or aristocratic background. The relatively privileged youth that his son Socrates seems to have enjoyed, however, suggests that he had achieved some financial success in his profession and had achieved some social standing in his community. Sophroniscus counted highly influential and wealthy Athenians among his friends, such as Lysimachus, the son of the Athenian statesman Aristides the Just. If Sophroniscus was indeed a stonemason or sculptor, he was probably not a lowly artisan or labourer, but perhaps the foreman of his own shop or quarry, the master mason. Descriptions of Socrates' mother, Phinarete, suggest that she was better born than Sophroniscus, another factor which points to the probable professional and social success of her husband. We know even less about Phinarete than we do about Sophroniscus. In one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates referred to her as a Maya, or midwife, but it is unclear if this was meant in a literal professional sense. Some scholars wonder if Socrates was not speaking metaphorically and referring instead to a matronly or nurturing quality in his mother. Athenian married women, even those of high social standing, had numerous domestic duties, which suggests that such women might not have had much time to dedicate themselves to pursuing a profession. However, according to one study of a small sample of ancient inscriptions, the majority of the professional midwives identified in classical Greece were free-born women of respectable status, if not high social status. Such women even published medical texts and lectured publicly in their area of expertise, so it's possible that Phinarete might have been a legitimately practicing midwife at one point or another in her life. There was no such thing as organized public education in Athens in Socrates' day. He would have learned to read and write at home with a tutor, most likely an enslaved non-Athenian Greek or other foreigner taken captive in war. Almost all Athenian families of middle-class or upper-class status owned at least a few slaves, and some of these individuals were tasked with educating the family's children until the age of 12, teaching them primarily to read and write, and perhaps also to do basic arithmetic. The male children of freeborn and affluent Athenians during the 5th century BC seemed to enjoy a good deal of freedom and stimulation. While they were expected to be silent and docile in adult company, boys nonetheless often accompanied their fathers into public spaces and adult forums. Young Socrates likely attended theatrical productions, religious festivals, athletic contests, informal public debates, or even banquets at the homes of family friends with his father. Athenian culture also placed marked emphasis on physical health and leisure, and thus games, sport, and exercise would have been valued and were encouraged for boys of all ages. Athenian boys learned to swim and to wrestle. They played games of chance against one another with knuckle bones, much like dice games. By the age of 12, Athenian boys of middle to high social status usually began attending lessons in gymnastics and music. Training at the gymnasia was emphasized as necessary not only for personal health, but to build strength and fitness among young, up-and-coming male citizens who would be required to serve in the military. Music studies in classical Athens were far more comprehensive as a subject area than they are today. Not only did the study of music involve learning to play an instrument, such as the lyre, the flute, or the aulus, a double reed pipe, but it also involved the study of dance and poetry. Under the tutelage of the famed music master Lampros, young Socrates learned to play the lyre, lessons which he resumed once again in middle age when the musician Konos began to instruct him in the newer, more innovative playing techniques. In his youth, Socrates would have been taught to sing and to dance, to memorize and recite poetry by Homer, Pindar, Sappho, Anacreon, and other lyric poets. As we see, music studies encompassed not only music and dance, but also literature, since much lyric poetry was set to music. Interestingly, music academies in classical Athens offered a good deal of history study and religious education, in addition to education in the artistic disciplines of music and dance. This is because the poets were not just poets, but also often historians and the documentarians of the legends of the gods, and music and dance was often instrumental in classical Greek religious rites. This period of musical and gymnastic education in Socrates' young life probably lasted for 2 to 4 years. It is also possible that Socrates might have begun apprenticing to his father's trade sometime during his teenage years or early 20s. Athenian law required that fathers secure a professional livelihood for their sons by the time they came of age, and it was fairly common for boys to pursue the same professions that their fathers had. Socrates may have spent any number of months or years working as a mason or a sculptor in his father's shop. Yet, even if he did, it may not have been something demanded of him, but perhaps something he pursued merely to keep himself busy and fit until he came of age and qualified for military service, something that was demanded of every young Athenian male citizen in Socrates' day. In 454 BC, when Socrates was about 15 years old, the Athenian assembly voted to remove the treasury of the Delian League from the island of Delos to Athens, supposedly to protect it from potential incursions by the Persians, whom the Greek member states of the Delian League had together defeated just a few decades before. While this immense war chest filled with gold and silver had been constituted for all of the League's member states, who all contributed to it annually for their mutual defense, the rulers of Athens, Pericles and the assembly, evidently decided that was more a suggestion than a requirement. This was the beginning of a series of developments which eventually led to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Pericles used the Delian treasury to benefit and beautify the city of Athens, which still bore the scars of the Persian invasion. He embarked on an ambitious building program which included impressive public edifices and spaces. The crowning glory of this revitalization project was the Parthenon, the exquisite temple of white marble built atop the Acropolis, with a magnificent ivory and gold statue of the goddess Athena within the temple sanctuary. No doubt the masons, sculptors, and other stoneworkers in Athens, perhaps even Socrates' father Sophroniscus, received many commissions and benefited handsomely from Pericles' building program. The Delian League soon began to break down as its member states grew more and more outraged that their annual tributes, intended for the defense of all, seemed instead to be simply enriching the city of Athens. Pericles soon began to launch military actions against these so-called rogue states who refused to continue paying tribute. Rather than a member state in a confederacy of equals, Athens was beginning to conduct itself more and more like an imperialist power, and other Greek states such as Sparta and Corinth began to mobilize against Athens and her remaining allies. By the time Socrates came of age, Athens would need every available citizen soldier ready to face a series of armed conflicts which would continue intermittently for more than 30 years. In the meantime, Socrates was still completing his education. At some point in his mid to late teens, the philosopher Archelaus became a tutor and mentor to Socrates. Archelaus was a student of the natural philosopher Anaxagoras, who was one of the first thinkers to attribute the workings of the cosmos to natural rather than divine phenomena. Having examined a fallen meteorite, Anaxagoras theorized that the sun was a fiery rock rather than the god Helios, as the Greeks believed. He further posited, correctly as it turned out, that moonlight was merely reflected sunlight. He similarly sought to explain phenomena such as volcanoes, earthquakes, and rainbows as likewise arising from natural processes rather than the divine wrath or benevolence of the gods. In his travel journal, a contemporary scholar, Ion of Chios, reported that in 451 BC, Socrates visited the island of Samos with his tutor Archelaus. It is likely that Archelaus wanted to introduce his young pupil to another one of his own teachers, fellow natural philosopher Melissus of Samos. This trip represents one of the few instances in Socrates' life when he was said to have left his home city-state of Athens and may have been comparable to a modern post-graduation tour. In Plato's Apology, Socrates speaks of the fascination he held in his youth for the study of the natural world. Although he eventually came to view the dawning field of natural science as less useful and less relevant to society than other philosophical pursuits and concerns, having mentors and teachers like Archelaus, doubtless helped awaken and foster in Socrates an empirical bent of mind which would prove crucial to the later development of his own philosophical framework. At the beginning of the Greek New Year, after Socrates reached the age of 18, he would have presented himself before the council of his deme, where he would have attained his citizenship and independence. He would have been eligible to claim any property or wealth held in trust for him, eligible to submit for election by lot to public office, for example, as a magistrate or justice of the peace, and eligible to attend and vote in the Athenian assembly. At this point in his life, an Athenian citizen was mostly free to do as he pleased in a professional and personal sense. In Pericles' Athens, however, the growing need for a robust military force meant that most young men and citizens of Socrates' age were called up for military training. The fact that Socrates seems to have become a career soldier for much of his life also attests to his family's comparatively high status. The expense of outfitting a hoplite soldier for a military career would have been nearly unattainable to a working-class Athenian, who probably made no more than 1 drachma a day, if that. The entire panoply of weapons and armor for a hoplite warrior could cost several hundred drachmas to make, unless one's father handed down his own armor and weapons to his son. New recruits in Athens began their military training with tours of duty around the Attica Peninsula, where they might patrol the outlying villages and Athenian frontier while engaging in regular training exercises. While they were learning and building discipline as a unit, this method of training allowed recruits to build knowledge while keeping them close to home and relatively safe. No sources report whether or not Socrates fought in the Battle of Coronea, which was the first major conflict of the Peloponnesian War. He would have been about 22 at the time, and of an age most likely to be called up. In the literature of the Socratic canon, Socrates is only explicitly mentioned as fighting in 2 particular battles, the Battle of Potidaea and the Battle of Delium. However, these 2 battles are spaced out over more than a decade, and it might therefore be reasonable to assume that Socrates spent a good portion of his life as a career soldier. Socrates was 38 years old when the 3-year campaign of Potidaea began, and 46 years old when the Battle of Delium occurred. Athenian troops were rarely required to serve so long, especially at so advanced an age, which might suggest that Socrates served voluntarily in these campaigns. If he served throughout such a length of time voluntarily and during middle age, it might also be reasonable to assume that he had also spent much of his younger life in his 20s or early 30s, becoming an adept and seasoned soldier. The image of the warrior poet is probably not one that many novice students of Socrates would expect to encounter, considering his more famous reputation in history as the barefooted, shabbily dressed, witty and good-humoured old intellectual. Socrates, however, seems to have had an impressive martial reputation on the battlefield. Interestingly, the name Socrates translates to safe in strength. His tolerance for discomfort, pain, and extreme temperatures was remarked upon by his fellow troops and friends. He was said to have marched barefoot and uncomplaining through ice and snow with little more than a light cloak to cover his armor and keep him warm. At the Battle of Potidaea, in 432 BC, he performed a daring rescue of his young protégé, Alcibiades, who had foolishly broken ranks and charged the battlefield in pursuit of the fleeing Corinthians. When Alcibiades impetuously charged forward, he did so alone, and the rest of his hoplite unit quickly closed up the gap their comrade had left, as they had been trained to do. Not one of his unit followed him forward. Breaking ranks in this fashion was ill-advised indeed, and could perhaps land a soldier in hot water with his superiors, for the shield of each soldier in the line helped guard the body of the man next to him, and enhanced the strength of the line itself against attack. Breaking ranks put one's fellow troops in real and immediate danger. When he saw his young friend fall before a reformed onslaught by the Corinthians, Socrates made the decision to break ranks himself. He rushed across the battlefield through the chaos of men hacking each other to bits before he reached Alcibiades. Carefully and gently, he bore the young man away along with his armor and fallen weapons off the battlefield to safety. Consistent with Socrates' reputation for eschewing ambitions for glory, fame, or preferment, Plato recorded that Socrates insisted that Alcibiades, not himself, should be decorated for bravery. One historian has posited that perhaps Socrates also avoided the adulation because he had, in fact, put his own unit in danger to save his young friend's life. Like the image of the warrior, the image of the strong, daring, able, and well-built young Socrates sits incongruously apart from our usual image of him as old, bearded, and fat, with a receding hairline, as he appears in his portraits and busts. Contemporaries of the elder Socrates, even his friends, described him as famously ugly. A short, balding man with a paunchy middle, a broad snub nose, thick lips, and widely spaced eyes that appeared to bulge. However, in the first bloom of youth as a career soldier, Socrates probably looked very different. Years of gymnastics, military training, if not slinging heavy stones in his father's workshop, would have given him a straight and well-built figure. His shortness would have appeared as stockiness and solid strength. He might even have been perceived as handsome. With his widely spaced eyes, broad nose, and very full lips situated in a younger face, and with what was likely an excellent physique, one is tempted to imagine someone akin to a young Marlon Brando. Although more than one biographer has sought to explore the figure of Socrates in love, we actually know very little about Socrates' personal or romantic life, although, again, that certainly hasn't stopped historians from speculating and theorizing. One recent biography posits that as a young man, Socrates might have fallen in love with the famed intellectual Aspasia, a philosopher herself and the de facto wife of Pericles. The textual evidence for this is rather thin. It involves accepting that a female figure named Diotima, whom Socrates mentions in Plato's Symposium as having been his instructress in all matters of love, is in fact Aspasia. The author points out that only one other woman who appears in any of Plato's other 30 dialogues as instructing any of her male contemporaries, including Socrates, is Aspasia herself. In Plato's Menexenus, she is also depicted as leading philosophical discussions about love. While some historians might find this textual evidence a bit of a stretch, the circumstantial evidence is somewhat more interesting and perhaps slightly more compelling. Sometime in his mid-30s or early 40s, Socrates became a tutor and mentor to the young Alcibiades. The young man he rescued from the battlefield in 432 BC was in fact the ward of Pericles himself, who had become Alcibiades' guardian upon the death of his friend Cleinias, the boy's father, years before. It is unclear whether Socrates took Alcibiades under his wing before or after the Battle of Potidaea, but Plato records that the two were posted together as tent mates and messmates throughout the campaign. Alcibiades was not only Pericles' ward, he was also a relation of Aspasia's by marriage. Probably about the same age as Socrates, Aspasia arrived in Athens in the early to mid-450s, at which time her sister was married to Alcibiades the elder, the grandfather of the younger Alcibiades. Aspasia lived in Athens for 2 years before she settled down with Pericles, who was twice her age, and had a son with him, Pericles the younger. During her early years in Athens, Aspasia quickly developed a reputation for her impressive education, intelligence, aristocratic bearing, and beauty, and her banquets and symposia were attended by some of Athens' most prominent citizens and thinkers, even Socrates himself, if Plato is correct. With all this in mind, it becomes more difficult to believe that Socrates did not run in the same social circles as Pericles and Aspasia. And yet, if they were friends, or at least social contemporaries, why is Plato so sparing in his references to Aspasia? And why is Pericles, who at some point entrusted his ward and the son of his old friend to the care and mentorship of Socrates, mentioned only once in any Socratic writings as having known or interacted with the famous philosopher? A branch of Pericles' family, the Alcmaeonids, even came from the same village as Socrates. Xanthippe, whom Socrates married in his elderly years, is believed by some scholars to have been Pericles' cousin. Considering all of these connections, one is tempted to view the virtual absence of both Pericles and Aspasia from Plato and Xenophon as deliberate. Perhaps it had more to do with the widespread unpopularity that Pericles suffered from later on, or the public hostility and resentment towards Aspasia, who was labelled a harlot among many Athenians for her influence over Pericles. Perhaps neither Plato nor Xenophon wanted Socrates tainted by association with these unpopular figures. Then again, a love affair between Socrates and Aspasia in their early 20s, before she married Pericles, might help explain why there are so many apparent connections between the three, but almost no recorded interactions between them in the Socratic canon. While this is all largely speculation, it is nonetheless quite interesting new scholarship for us to mull over. What is significantly more certain is that Socrates was married twice throughout his lifetime. His first wife was named Myrto, the daughter of his father's wealthy friend Lysimachus, and the granddaughter of Aristides the Just. Socrates is said to have refused to accept a dowry from Myrto's father, another factor which argues for his high status, for it likely suggests he did not need it. Very little is known about Myrto, but she was likely quite a few years younger than Socrates was. Plato records that when Socrates died at 70 years old, he had 2 sons approaching manhood. This suggests that Socrates' eldest son was born when he was in his late 40s or early 50s, implying that Myrto was probably at least a decade younger than her husband, if not younger. Myrto and Socrates had two sons, Menexenus and Sophroniscus. At some point during his 50s, Socrates took a young woman named Xanthippe into his household as his mistress. When his wife Myrto later died, Socrates married Xanthippe, and they had a son named Lamprocles, who was apparently still a child of indeterminate age when Socrates was executed in 399 BC. All of this being said, the details of Socrates' marriages are unclear, and different accounts suggest Socrates was married exclusively to Xanthippe. In between his military tours of duty and months or even years on campaign, Socrates pursued his ongoing study and development of philosophy in his beloved Athens. Socrates famously eschewed the pursuit of wealth and never accepted money from the students he taught. Some historians believe that Socrates inherited several rental properties from which he derived his income, and he would also have been paid a salary and pension for his military service, which puts a dent in his reputation as the impoverished intellectual. Still, the image of Socrates with which we are most familiar is the shabby, barefooted, genteel, friendly, and urbane sage about town who walked every day to the Athenian agora or public square to frequent the booksellers, converse with his friends, argue good-naturedly with acquaintances, or take the time to answer the questions of his pupils. Here, he would not only have kept abreast of all developments in the city, but he would also have become known to all Athens, from political elites, priests and shopkeepers, to artists, artisans, labourers, and his fellow citizens, young and old. Socrates regularly attended philosophical symposia at the homes of his wealthy friends, some of which are documented in the writings of Plato and Xenophon. These gatherings were essentially the ancient Greek equivalent of the 18th century French literary salon, in which aristocratic, educated, intellectually accomplished, and avant-garde members of society met to undertake serious examination and discussion of a particular point of philosophical inquiry, as well as to dine and drink together. Throughout his career as, quite literally, a public intellectual, known to all citizens of Athens, and willing to engage in dialogue with all, Socrates developed a body of beliefs and a method of inquiry which became part of the very bedrock of modern Western civilization. By the time he reached adulthood, Socrates was disillusioned by the natural philosophy that had so fascinated him as a younger man. The fields of physics and natural science were in their very infancy at the time, and the few questions they could claim to answer did not seem to hold much practical or social utility. What was the point, he wondered, of understanding the inner workings of the natural world if they could not answer the universal why of human existence? Instead, he turned his mind towards epistemological and moral philosophy, two areas of inquiry that he believed were far more consequential to human improvement, happiness, and social cohesion. Epistemology is the study of the nature and origin of knowledge, of which Socrates is one of the principal pioneers. What is knowledge? Socrates wondered. How is it gained? How do we know that the knowledge we possess is true? For Socrates, knowledge, and an understanding of it, was essential for the attainment of virtue, which in turn he believed was essential for individual human happiness and broader social harmony. Ultimately, the acquisition of knowledge and virtues like justice, wisdom, courage, piety, and temperate living would produce individuals who behaved according to what was right and avoided doing what was wrong. People who lived their lives in a morally incorrect way were invariably wretched and miserable, Socrates believed, while those who lived their lives according to moral and ethical standards were invariably happy. For Socrates, the continuous search for self-knowledge was paramount. The unexamined life, he is famously believed to have remarked, is not worth living. Alongside self-knowledge, Socrates believed that moral improvement and the cultivation of the soul were equally important goals for all people as individuals and as members of their communities. In addition to the fields of epistemology and ethics, Socrates also pioneered the techniques known to philosophers as the elenchus, the dialectic, and what teachers called the Socratic method. This is essentially a question and answer style of conversation. Elenchus is a process of cross-examination designed to expose the inaccuracy of another's belief or hypothesis, while the dialectic is a more collaborative question and answer exchange intended to encourage reasoned conclusions or knowledge to emerge. The dialectic approach is akin to what Socrates pursued during symposia and what teachers who today embrace the Socratic method do in their own classrooms when they use a guided question and answer approach to help the class reach conclusions as a group. According to Socrates himself, it may have been the use of his elenchus technique that caused significant dislike of him to grow among his fellow Athenians. After all, few of us find it easy to like people who seem determined to show us that we're not as smart as we think we are. While defending himself at his own trial in Plato's Apology, Socrates narrated a series of events which, when they occurred, could not have failed to spark public resentment against him for what was probably perceived as self-aggrandizement. This episode he describes also appears in Xenophon's Memorabilia, albeit with slight embellishments. So the story goes, a friend of Socrates and fellow philosopher by the name of Chaerephon visited the oracle at Delphi and asked of her, "Who is wiser than Socrates?" To the surprise and perplexity of both men, the oracle replied, "No one is wiser than Socrates." This response utterly perplexed Socrates, whose first instinct was to reject the notion that he might be the wisest of all men. In Xenophon's version, Socrates was present when the oracle made her famous pronouncement, and he was said to have dwelt long and thoughtfully upon the inscription etched above the entrance to Apollo's temple, "Know thyself." This experience, Socrates said, spurred him to investigate the oracle's claim as thoroughly as he could, believing that he would eventually prove her wrong. He described approaching and conversing with many of his fellow Athenians, beginning with those generally considered to be the most knowledgeable and accomplished in the city, such as politicians and scholars. He observed, however, that all of those whom others believed to be the most wise, and who believed themselves to be so, were invariably unable to conclusively defend their claims to superior knowledge. He then turned to the artisans and skilled tradesmen, who were indeed wise and competent in their own particular craft pursuits, but held little knowledge or wisdom about higher concerns, though many of them also believed themselves to be wise. The difference between Socrates and the individuals he questioned was that he made no claims to the superiority of his wisdom. "As for me, all I know is that I know nothing," he famously remarked. For Socrates, the near impossibility of ensuring that any knowledge constitutes an ultimate and verifiable truth should encourage intellectual humility. The part that he left unsaid was that perhaps this was precisely what the Delphic oracle meant when she said that no one is wiser than Socrates. No doubt, Socrates used his elenchus method in interrogating his fellow Athenians' claims to wisdom. This technique often ends in what is known as aporia, which is an unresolvable logical impasse or dead end in an argument. As a man who openly claimed he didn't have all the answers, Socrates was not out to tell people the right ones, merely to show that through the acquisition of knowledge and the use of reason, one could expose the wrong-headed beliefs of those who thought themselves wise. His ultimate lesson was to question everything, even supposedly settled knowledge, and to be aware that no matter how impressive one's intellectual attainments might be, one always finds oneself once again on the frontier of knowledge. Unfortunately, but quite predictably, many of his fellow Athenians took offense at his deconstruction of their beliefs and claims to wisdom, and Socrates' reduction of their arguments to a state of aporia surely made him many enemies, some of which would eventually put him on trial for his life. The reputation and fame that Socrates attained during his life in Athens is apparent in the works of not only scholars, but artists too. He was caricatured in the works of Athenian playwrights, most notably by Aristophanes in his comedy The Clouds, which premiered in Athens in 423 BC. This play lampooned Socrates as a skinny, half-mad, stringy-haired ascetic with absurdly high-flown ideas about the nature and workings of the heavens and the earth. His character was depicted floating above the stage in a basket, suspended by ropes and pulleys, in which the old philosopher's own flatulence appeared to propel him here and there. In some respects, we must admit that comedy hasn't changed much in more than 2,000 years. Socrates' discussion and description of Aristophanes' play in Plato's Apology suggests that Socrates might have seen the comedy himself when it was performed in Athens. Aristophanes and Socrates were at least friendly acquaintances, if not friends, if the text in Plato's Symposium is to be believed. This text, and many others which Plato wrote, illustrate that Socrates had a playful, easy-going nature and a great sense of humor. Socrates may have even thought that Aristophanes' play was quite funny at the time. Sadly, the attributions made to him in such public forums, that he claimed superior knowledge of the heavens and the earth, would come back to bite him later on. Several more public marks against Socrates' reputation appeared over the next 15 years. Throughout this period, 2 of his former pupils were involved in political and military developments considered both reprehensible and treasonous by many Athenians, beginning with Socrates' beloved young pupil and friend, Alcibiades. Elected general at just 30 years old, the handsome, dashing and boastful Alcibiades convinced the Athenian assembly to undertake and give him command of the Sicilian campaign of 415 to 413 BC. He persuaded them to commission hundreds of ships, the deployment of 10,000 hoplite soldiers and 30,000 naval men. It was by far the largest and most expensive force Athens had ever assembled. The day after it launched, political foes of Alcibiades levelled charges against him for profaning the mysteries. He was accused of vandalizing numerous shrines to the god Hermes and for making light of the gods in public at a masquerade. The Athenian authorities sent troops to Sicily to arrest Alcibiades, who then escaped and defected to the side of the Spartans. Alcibiades' betrayal brought significant intelligence advantages to the Spartans and utter disaster to the Sicilian campaign, resulting in the biggest military loss in troops and ships in Athenian history up until that point. This was a financial disaster which many Athenians blamed for the weakening of their military strength at a particularly crucial juncture of the Peloponnesian War. Athens was defeated in 404 BC, at which time the Spartans installed an oppressive oligarchic council to rule the formerly democratic Athens. This body became known as the 30 Tyrants, who ruled over Athens until 403 BC, when they were overthrown by pro-democracy Athenians and the previous regime was restored. Prominent among the 30 tyrants was a man called Critias, another former pupil of Socrates. When he and the rest of the Spartan junta were finally removed from power, pro-democracy Athenians remembered the old association between the old know-it-all philosopher and his authoritarian pupil. The anger against the two young men who many viewed as arch-traitors to Athens made Socrates seem guilty by association rather than by any action of his own. His enemies also noted that Socrates was not censured or punished by Critias or the 30 for refusing to arrest a man he knew to be innocent, Leon of Salamis, who the oligarchs wanted to execute. This is the only instance in which Socrates was known to serve in public office. He served a one-year term from 404 to 403 BC, and it was likely only the fall of the tyrants that saved him from their wrath. Still, after all of the upheaval that had been wrought by two traitors to Athens, many continued to mutter darkly about Socrates and to wonder if his pupils' actions were the fault of their mentor. In 399 BC, 3 men of Athens, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, laid charges against Socrates for impiety and for corrupting the city's youth. They claimed that Socrates had denied the existence of the gods of Athens, invented new gods, that he had claimed to understand the workings of the heavens and the earth, and that he used his talent for rhetoric to corrupt and lead young people astray. To the modern ear, few, if any, of these charges sound like prosecutable crimes. However, the justice system of classical Athens featured no official prosecutors or defense attorneys. All prosecutorial actions were initiated by private citizens. The accusers and accused were each given an equal amount of time to present their case. This time limit was determined by a water clock, which applied only to the speeches of accuser and accused. The clock was stopped temporarily whenever a witness was called. Cases were heard by the laws, or judges of Athens, and verdicts were decided by a jury of 500 Athenians, selected by lot. The rationale of impaneling such large juries was that it would make bribery nearly impossible. Socrates used his allotted time and his verbal skills to defend himself as thoroughly as possible. His defense forms the full text of Plato's Apology, an ironic title, given there is nothing apologetic about it. Socrates took his time addressing and deconstructing each charge demonstrating that none were founded in fact. He pointed out that he had, in the past, inadvertently made enemies of his accusers by showing their pretensions of wisdom to be false. Incensed, his accusers now levelled charges at him which were based on unfounded rumours, suppositions, and public propaganda which had been spoken about Socrates at various times over the years. The jury found Socrates guilty nonetheless by a slim margin of just 30 votes. When his time came to be sentenced, his accusers demanded the death penalty. Athenian justice provided that a defendant who was found guilty might propose their own punishment, which a jury might accept since it showed remorse and an attempt at restitution. It was also a chance for a jury to use their judgment as to whether the harsher punishment often demanded by accusers was merited. Socrates seems to have shot himself in the foot, so to speak, at this stage of the trial, but his reasoning was clear. Since, he said, he was not guilty of the crimes of which he was accused, to volunteer himself to be punished would be to concede that he had done something wrong, which he had not. He had dedicated his life to the cultivation and improvement of his beloved city, giving freely of his knowledge and instruction to anyone who sought it, for which he never charged any fees. His shabby clothes, bare feet, and temperate habits could clearly testify to his poverty, as he described it, which he gladly endured, since he viewed all ambitions for wealth and glory as leading to unhappiness and corruption. In fact, Socrates asserted, instead of being punished, he ought to be rewarded, and requested that the city of Athens offer him free meals for life, as public benefactors and victorious Olympians received. This suggestion may well have been a joke, but it likely didn't go over well. Socrates concluded with an offer to pay a fine of 100 drachmas, which amounted to about a fifth of his estate. If this were unacceptable, he said, 4 friends of his who were present at the trial, Plato himself, Crito, and his son Critobulus and Apollodorus, were prepared to pay a fine of 3,000 drachmas on Socrates' behalf. The jury sentenced Socrates to death, strangely by a larger margin than the verdict that had convicted him. When asked if he had anything to say, Socrates spoke directly to the jury. To those who had seen the justice in his defense, he offered thanks and praise for their civic and judicial integrity. Those who had condemned him, he stated, had ultimately condemned themselves in the eyes of history, and he prophesied that men would always speak of their actions as deliberately dishonorable. Still, as a loyal Athenian committed to the rule of law, he accepted the verdict and his sentence. Socrates spent about a month in jail prior to his execution, which was a rare occurrence indeed, since sentences were normally carried out within a day or two. However, the day before Socrates' trial, the annual religious pilgrimage to the island of Delos began. The pilgrimage commemorated Theseus's defeat of the Minotaur. According to tradition, until the ship returned to Athens, no criminals could be executed in the city. Socrates therefore had to wait several weeks for his sentence to be carried out. This was a luxury that few condemned people in the ancient world enjoyed. Socrates spent the time putting his affairs in order, spending time with his family and receiving visits from his friends. He was well cared for by his jailer, who evidently liked him and dreaded having to administer the execution. Plato's Crito and Phaedo document the last few days of Socrates' life. His friends, most notably his friend Crito, urged him to escape from prison. He had clearly been unjustly condemned, Crito and others argued. Even his jailer had offered to let him escape, but Socrates refused to do so. He had lived in Athens all his life, he said. It had given him a life he had valued enough to remain there and to raise his children there. In doing so, he had tacitly agreed to accept the laws and the judgments of Athenian institutions. Despite the fact that justice had failed him, that was no reason to become a lawbreaker himself, by which means he would forfeit all of his integrity and endanger his soul. For Socrates, two wrongs did not make a right. On his last day, Socrates spent some private time with his sons and his wife Xanthippe. He sent them away as the day wore on, to spare them from having to witness his execution, which was to take place at sunset. He spent his remaining hours on earth conversing with his friends on the nature of life and death, his beliefs about the immortality of the soul, and his conviction that death is not the end. He comforted them when some of them began to cry as sunset approached. Who can say for sure, he asked, whether death is not better than life? When his jailer arrived with a draught of hemlock, Socrates bade them all farewell before drinking the poison and laying down on his bed to await the end. He spoke his last words to his friend Crito before covering his face with a piece of cloth. I owe a cock to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt. Scholars have endlessly debated the meaning of these words. Asclepius was a deified cult hero whom worshippers believed could prevent or cure illness if they made sacrifices to him. Did Socrates have an actual debt to pay to a deity he believed had previously interceded for him? Did he, perhaps, see life as the illness of which he was being cured and asked Crito to make a sacrifice of thanksgiving for him? The debate goes on, as do many others relating to the life of Socrates. Despite the numerous questions still surrounding him, Socrates has achieved a level of lasting fame and immortality that one can only compare to religious figures in history such as the Buddha, Jesus, or Lao Tzu. All four of them were teachers, all placed marked emphasis on self-knowledge and the cultivation of the soul for moral improvement, but alone among them, Socrates was never deified. This is not to say that Socrates had no influence on religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. Socrates' ideas on the nature and immortality of the soul and his views on ethics had incalculable influence on the early fathers of the Christian Church. The Socratic canon remains a mainstay in the libraries of Christian theology scholars today. Furthermore, his impact on education, law, and politics is still strikingly evident today. Socratic teaching methods are standard in Western classrooms at all levels of education. Political and legal scholars continue to argue about exactly where Socrates landed when it comes to democracy versus oligarchy, or the social contract theory versus civil disobedience. Of course, not every subsequent philosopher or writer liked or agreed with Socrates' ideas, most notably Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously savaged the beliefs of Socrates in his 19th century works Twilight of the Gods and The Antichrist. Socrates' greatest gift to us is considered by many to be his championing of empiricism and reason. Despite his rejection of natural philosophy, Socrates never reached any conclusion. Even those concerning metaphysical phenomena such as the soul, without employing a reasoned and logical approach which was always open to question and criticism. His epistemological framework for establishing what is true according to what is readily observable would eventually be developed by Aristotle into the first incarnation of the scientific method. Finally, Socrates' doctrine of superior authority helped establish for the first time that there was a higher authority other than the political or the legal, which only offer the threat of force to compel compliance. For Socrates, the higher authority might be divine, or his own moral conscience, or perhaps reason itself. There is cause to believe that he viewed these entities as quite intimately connected. Though he refused to escape from an unjust imprisonment and execution, and while ultimately his enemies got their pound of flesh, Socrates was ultimately triumphant. Plato, Xenophon, and other writers immortalized him as a martyr to reason and integrity. The ongoing search for the historical Socrates continues, and while some might call the quest futile, considering the paucity of sources available and the doubts surrounding their potential authenticity, many historians take their cue from Socrates himself. Even if one of his dialectics ended in an irresolvable aporia, with the sense that the answer might never be known or settled, that was no justification to cease questioning. Though a clear picture of the historical Socrates has largely remained stubbornly out of reach, scholars will likely still continue to pursue this most elusive figure who, paradoxically, looms larger than almost anyone in the history of Western civilization. What do you think of Socrates? Does he deserve the title, the father of Western philosophy? Please, let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on the 15th of October 1844 in the village of Röhrken, near the town of Lützen, in what was then the Kingdom of Prussia. He was named after King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia, on whose birthday he was born. Friedrich's father was Ludwig Nietzsche, a 31-year-old Lutheran priest at the local church. After receiving his religious training at the University of Halle, Ludwig had spent 7 years working as a private tutor to the 3 daughters of Duke Joseph of Saxe-Altenburg, a minor prince and a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. In 1842, soon after taking up his post at Röhrken, Ludwig met 17-year-old Franziska Oehler. The pair were married the following October, on Ludwig's 30th birthday. The daughter of the priest of the nearby parish of Porbels, Franziska was 19 years old when she gave birth to Friedrich. The couple had 2 further children, a daughter in 1846 named Elisabeth, and a son 2 years later that they named Ludwig Joseph. Nietzsche's recollections of his earliest years were dominated by his father, who was a well-respected member of their community. Living in a scholarly house, little Friedrich enjoyed playing with the books that were proudly displayed in his father's study. This idyllic existence would soon be disrupted by the revolutions of 1848, which swept across the European continent that spring and summer. The conservative Nietzsches were horrified when the King of Prussia was forced to acquiesce to many of the demands of the Prussian revolutionaries. Yet there were more personal problems soon facing the family. A few months later, Friedrich's father began suffering from a series of seizures, which doctors could not explain, and he died in July 1849. A few months later, in January 1850, Friedrich's younger brother Ludwig Joseph also died, a few weeks short of his 2nd birthday. After the death of his father and youngest brother, Friedrich moved with his family to the town of Naumburg, where his parental grandmother, Erdmutter, and 2 aunts lived. The young 5-year-old Friedrich, nicknamed Fritz, initially struggled to adjust to the more urban life in Naumburg. In 1851, he began to receive lessons from a priest in training named Weber, and soon became close friends with 2 classmates, Wilhelm Pinder, who lived with his family in one of the town's most prestigious houses, and the latter's cousin, Gustav Krug, the son of a prominent local official and accomplished musician. In October 1854, 10-year-old Fritz and his friends were admitted to the Cathedral High School. 2 years later, the Nietzsches moved into a larger house. With a new piano at his disposal, Fritz received lessons from a local choir master and proved a talented musician. In October 1857, not long after his 13th birthday, Friedrich began to suffer from serious headaches. His mother took him out of school until he recovered his health. By the time he returned to school in early 1858, he had written 2 short plays. His literary output continued later in the year on a visit to his maternal relations at Pöbels, where he wrote a brief autobiographical account of his young life, including idyllic reminiscences of his father's house at Röken. Commenting on the music he heard in his father's church, the 13-year-old Nietzsche defended the classical tradition of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, which leads our thoughts to higher things, while describing the music of contemporary romantic composers such as Liszt and Berlioz as decadent and of limited value from a cultural perspective, as it was being used, quote, solely for enjoyment or to make a public exhibition of itself. Although he would spend his adult life challenging such moral prejudices, the teenage Nietzsche was already displaying the literary talent that would make him a profound writer, critic, and thinker. In September 1858, not long after Nietzsche returned to Naumburg, he received a scholarship to study at the prestigious Pforta boarding school west of Naumburg. The curriculum here was typical of the 19th century and focused on the study of classical languages, including Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. While the school timetable provided for 10 hours of studying each day, Nietzsche adapted quickly and was consoled by the proximity to Naumburg, which enabled him to meet his family regularly. However, he regretted being separated from his friends, Wilhelm and Gustav, both of whom continued their studies in the town. After a memorable visit to the university town of Jena during his summer break in July 1859, Nietzsche returned to Pforta in August and finished top of the class in his exams. However, the year was marred by the death of his 72-year-old grandfather, David Uerler, which forced his maternal relatives to move away from Pöbels. In the summer of 1860, Nietzsche, Wilhelm Pinder, and Gustav Krug formed a 3-man literary society called Germania, agreeing to meet regularly and discuss their respective musical and literary outputs. As part of this pursuit, Nietzsche began writing a Christmas oratorio. In November, he received a lengthy letter from Krug in which he praised Richard Wagner's opera Tristan und Isolde, a tempestuous 5-hour spectacle based on Arthurian legend which had not yet been performed but whose musical scores were already available and being analyzed by critics. For the time being, Nietzsche did not share his friends' enthusiasm for Wagner's work, though that would change in time. He continued to work on his oratorio, but was once again affected by his migraines. Over the course of 1861, he also began to drift towards the music of Liszt, which he had earlier denounced as sinful, and began to take an interest in Slavic and Hungarian folklore. The year also had a transformative impact on Nietzsche's thinking about history and literature. For school, he wrote a provocative essay defending Friedrich Hölderlin, a poet and philosopher who contrasted German barbarism with the achievements of classical antiquity and who had supported the French Revolution. Elsewhere, Nietzsche was inspired by the English poet Lord Byron, in particular his superhuman romantic hero Manfred. Far more controversial was an essay which he composed around this time, which was supportive of Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, and a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose armies had inflicted so much devastation on Germany a half a century earlier. Nietzsche's text was criticized by both his friends, an early sign of Friedrich's willingness to court controversy in his writing. In the period that followed, Nietzsche's creativity increased as his thinking continued to develop. In an essay entitled Fate and History, Nietzsche came to the realization that an individual who is theoretically free is in fact obeying a wide range of customs and traditions ingrained into them from childhood, which he called fate. For Nietzsche, an individual who was truly free had to constantly battle against the constraints of fate. This realization led him to reject his Christian upbringing, marking the beginning of Nietzsche's lifelong quest to break free from the chains of Christian morality. Despite frequent bouts of poor health and headaches, Nietzsche continued to meet with academic success at Pforta. By the autumn of 1862, he was finally ready to embrace Wagner after the Germania Society acquired a copy of the score of Tristan und Isolde. Sitting at his piano, Nietzsche valiantly joined Krug in making their way through the opera. Nietzsche was so impressed that he took the score with him to Pforta, deaf to Krug's complaints that it was his idea to purchase it. In his efforts to tear down the rules around him, Nietzsche had begun joining his classmates in smoking and drinking. But in the spring of 1863, a teacher ran into him as he and a friend were returning to school from a drunken binge, resulting in him being moved back a semester. His pursuit of his literary interests caused his grades to fall, and he only just managed to pass his final exams in the late summer of 1864. While his friends Wilhelm Pinder and Gustav Krug went to university at Heidelberg, Nietzsche opted to study theology at Bonn, despite his growing religious pessimism. Nietzsche arrived at Bonn in October, accompanied by his Pforta classmate Paul Deussen, who would later become a renowned Sanskrit scholar. Here he attended lectures by the preeminent philologists Otto Jahn and Friedrich Ritschl. Philology is considered a relatively arcane field of endeavor today, yet in the 19th century it was at the cutting edge of European scholarship. As a discipline, it combines literary criticism with analysis of texts and languages, all within a historical framework. It's important to bear this in mind, as most contemporaries considered Nietzsche to primarily be a philologist rather than a philosopher, as he is more often deemed to have been today. As well as this, much of his earlier work falls very clearly into the realm of philology. When he returned to Naumburg for the Easter holidays in 1865, Nietzsche shocked his mother by informing her that he was no longer planning to become a priest. His growing interest in philology had informed him of how myths come into being, and he increasingly recognized that the early Christians had transformed the historical Jesus of Nazareth into a divine figure in a similar fashion. Supporting his arguments with a copy of David Strauss's Life of Jesus, and which attributed the Gospels in the Bible to early Christians several decades after Jesus' death, Nietzsche stubbornly resisted his family's efforts to convince him to return to theology. When he returned to Bonn, he formally transferred to the Faculty of Philology. Nietzsche soon decided that Bonn was not for him, and opted to transfer to the University of Leipzig in his native Saxony. Aside from financial considerations, Nietzsche had decided to follow Friedrich Ritschl, who had recently been recruited by Leipzig. Soon after his arrival at Leipzig in October 1865, the 21-year-old Nietzsche discovered the work of the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who would become the greatest influence on his thinking. In his book, The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer built on the work of his great predecessor, Immanuel Kant, by arguing that the empirical world is only a representation constructed from sensual perceptions, while the true world is defined by an unknowable will that exists among all living beings. In his efforts to understand this enigmatic force, Schopenhauer anticipated Darwin by recognizing that nature is a struggle for survival. Although humans had achieved a dominant position in nature through superior intellect, Schopenhauer pessimistically saw the human will as one which relentlessly pursues its desires only to encounter boredom after attaining them. The only way to escape the suffering of the human condition was to appreciate the wonders of nature and art. In early 1866, Nietzsche furthered his intellectual pursuits by founding a philological club and presenting a paper which caught the attention of Professor Ritschl, who offered to support him in getting his work published. At this time, Saxony found itself caught up in a war between Prussia, the dominant power in northern Germany, and the Austrian Habsburg Empire, the largest German region in the south of Central Europe. After the Prussians won a decisive victory at Königgrätz in July, Prussia extended its influence and Saxony effectively became a Prussian protectorate. Notwithstanding his academic success, in September 1867, Nietzsche was swept up in the German patriotic fervor and enlisted in an artillery regiment. In March 1868, he was badly injured after falling from his horse. He took advantage of his recovery to work on his academic contributions. Shortly before entering military service, he had written a prize-winning essay on the 3rd century AD Greek historian and biographer of the ancient philosophers, Diogenes Laertius. Laertius is our foremost source for the details of the lives of many of the ancient world's most important philosophers. Men such as Zeno of Citium, the founder of the school of philosophy known as Stoicism. Nietzsche's essay on Laertius was subsequently published in a prestigious journal edited by Ritschl, who would accept 2 more of Nietzsche's contributions in 1868. At just 24 years of age, Nietzsche was firmly on the path to academic stardom when he returned to Leipzig in October 1868, after his military service. Following an introduction from a friend, on the 8th of November, Nietzsche was invited to a private gathering to meet one of his idols, Richard Wagner. After Wagner entertained his small audience by playing extracts from his operas, he and Nietzsche talked about philosophy, and the latter was delighted to hear that his favorite composer was also an enthusiastic admirer of Schopenhauer. At the end of the meeting, Wagner invited Nietzsche to visit him at his home in Lucerne in Switzerland to continue their discussions. As chance would have it, not long afterwards, Nietzsche received an astonishing offer to take up a professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. Motivated by the salary of 3,000 Swiss francs a year, Nietzsche left for the Alpine country in March 1869 to take on a professorship without even having completed his university degree. Clearly, his early published work had convinced his new departmental colleagues in Basel that the young man was worth hiring, degree or no degree. While he struggled with being away from friends and family in Germany, Nietzsche did make frequent trips to Wagner's villa at Tribschen on the shores of Lake Lucerne after arriving in Switzerland. There he cultivated good relations with Wagner's mistress and future wife, Cosima von Bülow, the daughter of Franz Liszt, whom he would later praise as the model for womanhood. Nietzsche was glad to become part of his idol's intimate circle at a time when Wagner was working on Siegfried, the 3rd part of his epic Ring cycle based on Germanic mythology, while the composer appreciated the young philologist's interest in his work. After spending Christmas with the Wagners, Nietzsche delivered 2 controversial lectures in early 1870, in which he argued that the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, a revered figure in the canon of Western philosophy, was partly responsible for the degeneration of Greek culture from the heights of epic poetry and tragedy. He would soon expand out these ideas, arguing that classical Greek culture was actually at its height in the 6th and early 5th centuries BC, and that figures like Socrates in the late 5th century BC, with what Nietzsche viewed as a rather simplistic philosophical approach, represented a decline. In April 1870, Nietzsche had his post at Basel confirmed as a permanent one, but his joy was short-lived after learning that he would be teaching 20 hours a week, a schedule which would leave him little time for his own research and writing. He received a further shock a few weeks later when Wagner informed his close friends that he was intending to move away from Tribschen, his own opera theatre at Bayreuth in Bavaria, under the patronage of his admirer, King Ludwig II, where he hoped to stage his ring cycle with musicians trained under his direction. A disconsolate Nietzsche wrote to Cosima suggesting that he might leave his academic post after a year or two and follow Wagner to Bayreuth. Meanwhile, Nietzsche's life was further disrupted when Napoleon III of France declared war on Prussia in July 1870. After spending his summer holiday with the Wagners, he obtained leave from the university to serve as a medical orderly in eastern France, and arrived at the headquarters of the Prussian Southern Army at Nancy in Lorraine just before the Prussians defeated the French decisively at Sedan on the 2nd of September 1870. Although the Franco-Prussian War was a short one and soon ended in January 1871 with the unification of the German Empire under Prussian domination, a move orchestrated by the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, Nietzsche's views on it evolved in the few short months of the conflict. This was in part owing to his contracting both diphtheria and dysentery during his time as a medical orderly, conditions which further damaged his always precarious health. As a result, he took a dimmer view of the Prussian aggression by the time the war came to an end. During the winter of 1870, while recovering from his ailments, he began to make plans to move away from his focus on philology in favor of studying philosophy more directly. After a joyful Christmas holiday, during which he had the privilege of witnessing Wagner perform his Siegfried Idyll as a surprise birthday gift for Cosima, Nietzsche sank into a depression when several friends refused to join him in Basel. Further disappointment followed when Nietzsche's request to take over the chair of philosophy in the university was denied. While recovering his health in Lugano in Italian Switzerland, Nietzsche worked on a study of Greek tragedy, which eventually became a book under the title The Birth of Tragedy, published in December 1871. Nietzsche identified with Greek tragedy a struggle between Apollonian and Dionysian forces, the former representing order and reason and the latter chaos and emotion. These forces were manifested in the cults of Apollo, the Greek god of music and dance, and Dionysius, the Greek god of wine, excess, ecstasy, and madness. Nietzsche saw music as the highest representation of the Dionysian concept and speculated that the epic poetry of ancient Greece had been inspired by music. The book was dedicated to Wagner, whom Nietzsche argued had emulated the Greek tragedians in achieving a perfect balance of Apollonian and Dionysian elements. The composer was delighted with Nietzsche's work and asked the author to send copies to his patron, King Ludwig of Bavaria, and his father-in-law, Franz Liszt. Although the book proved popular among artists and musicians, the academic community was less enamored by Nietzsche's conjectural approach to philology, and Nietzsche was disappointed to find his mentor, Friedrich Ritschl, among his critics. That said, any reader of The Birth of Tragedy today will find a refreshingly novel insight into classical Greek culture. Nietzsche was already very much carving out his own path by the early 1870s when it came to his interpretations. Nietzsche saw himself along with Wagner as the vanguard of a movement striving to return German culture to the heights it had attained at the turn of the 19th century, the era of Kant, Mozart, Goethe, and Beethoven. In early 1872, he delivered a series of public lectures attacking the German education system and warning against the trend towards the democratization of education. While he recognized a need for the practical training of state officials, farmers, and factory workers, he argued that cultural education and intellectualism was being denigrated by making it overly functional, with the goal that individuals should solely be training for a profession at all times, rather than engaging in scholarship as an end in and of itself. In May, he went to Bayreuth to attend a ceremony marking the laying down of the foundation stone of Wagner's new theatre at Bayreuth, an edifice built to the composer's specifications. Back in Basel, Nietzsche soon found himself in the middle of a vicious debate in the pages of the national newspapers about the merits of his book, The Birth of Tragedy. While he appreciated the publicity, he realized that most of his fellow philologists were against him, and after spending his summer holidays in Italy, Nietzsche returned to Basel to find that only 2 students had signed up to his course on Greek and Roman rhetoric. He was forced to abandon a second lecture course on Homer altogether. Unperturbed, Nietzsche now decided to work on a study of pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, which he hoped to publish under the title Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, in time for Wagner's 60th birthday in May 1873. When he visited the Wagners in early April in Bayreuth to inspect construction work on the theatre, Nietzsche's reading from his latest work received a somewhat cool reception, and his efforts to lighten the mood by playing one of his compositions on the piano were likewise received awkwardly. By early May, Nietzsche had almost finished his new book when he became distracted by the publication of The Old and New Faith by David Strauss, the writer whose Life of Jesus had inspired Nietzsche to give up religion. Now, 4 decades after the Life of Jesus first appeared, Strauss's latest work set out a vision of progressive Christianity that labeled Schopenhauer's pessimistic diagnosis of the human condition as the product of a, quote, putrefying brain. Nietzsche was infuriated by this and wrote a polemical essay targeting Strauss as the representative of a contemporary cultural Philistinism in Germany that had stopped seeking truth and beauty and instead looked for easy and comfortable answers. This polemic of Nietzsche's against Strauss was the first of a series of 4 essays which would eventually be published together in 1876 under the title Untimely Meditations. In the next installment, under the heading On the Use and Abuse of History for Life, Nietzsche argued that it was worth studying the past as a reminder that it was possible for humanity to achieve greatness, but warned against hero worship and myth-making, suggesting that periodically the past should be re-examined with an eye to the future. Nietzsche then proceeded to attack the scientific approach to history in Germany, which served to undermine the power of the past. In another essay from this time, entitled Schopenhauer as Educator, he praised the manner in which Schopenhauer sought to liberate his readers from convention. It certainly influenced Nietzsche. He was nothing if not original in his views. For the 4th of his Untimely Meditations, Nietzsche turned his attention to art with a piece entitled Richard Wagner in Bayreuth. Although he had written most of it by early 1875, he was once again struck down by ill health that would leave him almost blind. Scholars have debated what afflicted Nietzsche for well over a century. Many have concluded that he was suffering from tertiary syphilis, but it may have been a number of different ailments that gradually became worse over time, notably gastric spasms, hemorrhoids, debilitating headaches, failing eyesight, and eventually fits and fainting spells. Some have speculated that these myriad neurological issues indicate the development of a brain tumor. It was not until July 1876 that Nietzsche recovered enough from this latest bout of ill health that he managed to complete the manuscript of Richard Wagner in Bayreuth with the assistance of a young musician and admirer named Heinrich Koselleck. Copies were immediately sent out to Wagner, who urged Nietzsche to hurry to Bayreuth. Final rehearsals in advance of the premiere of The Ring Cycle in mid-August. Nietzsche arrived there by the 22nd of July, but found the town full of aristocrats who were there for the social occasion rather than any particular appreciation of Wagner's work. Keen to get away from the crowds, Nietzsche refused an invitation to meet the King of Bavaria. The University of Basel now granted Nietzsche a year-long sabbatical. He spent the first part of it in Italy with Malvida von Meisenburg, a German aristocrat who had turned her back on her family and befriended several prominent European revolutionaries, and was an enthusiastic admirer of both Wagner and Nietzsche's work. Although Meisenburg was 28 years Nietzsche's senior, she became one of his closest confidants after their first meeting in Munich several years earlier. Nietzsche traveled to Sorrento in the Bay of Naples with two companions, Albert Brenner and Dr. Paul Rey. Both of them had previously been his students. Under Rey's influence, Nietzsche found himself questioning Schopenhauer's more pessimistic writings. He also became embroiled in a disagreement with Wagner at this time, whose German nationalism Nietzsche was increasingly critical of. Aside from any philosophical disagreements, Wagner knew that his ambitions for Nietzsche to edit a journal to promote his ideas about music and art were unlikely to be realized, given Nietzsche's poor health. Following his return to Basel in the autumn of 1877, Nietzsche went to Dr. Otto Eiser in Frankfurt for a medical examination. The doctor diagnosed a damaged optic nerve as the source of his failing eyesight and prescribed his patient, quote, an absolute avoidance of reading and writing for years to come. This was an instruction Nietzsche was never going to even remotely consider following. During his sabbatical, Nietzsche had been working on a fifth untimely meditation about the human condition, but by the time the manuscript was completed, it had become a separate book of more than 300 pages, under the title Human, All Too Human. This was published in the spring of 1878, composed of a series of 638 aphorisms intended to communicate his thoughts concisely, if not systematically. Nietzsche argued that there were no eternal truths, and that the efforts of Kant and Schopenhauer to discover such truths were fundamentally misguided. In a dramatic reversal of his earlier views, Nietzsche now placed science on a higher level than art, arguing that small scientific discoveries had done much to advance human progress. While Nietzsche continued to acknowledge the importance of art, he described it as a bridge to facilitate the transition from religion and superstition to his free-spirited way of thinking. Indeed, the subtitle of the book was A Book for Free Spirits. Elsewhere in the book, he continued his relentless attack on Christianity by asserting that its core precepts had no rational and scientific basis, that its notions of good and evil were social constructs which had no place in the modern world. Nietzsche knew that his new book would infuriate Wagner and chose not to send him a copy. Later, he heard from his and Wagner's publisher, Ernst Schmeitzner, that the composer had acquired a copy of the book but did not read much of it before setting it aside in order not to disturb the positive impression he had of Nietzsche's early work. Many of Nietzsche's friends were equally critical after reading the book and were especially troubled by his rejection of morality. In response to his critics, Nietzsche doubled down by writing a second part entitled Mixed Opinions and Maxims, offering another 400-odd aphorisms in which he argued that Christian humility and self-denial was in fact a manifestation of a self-centered desire to avoid eternal damnation, and that Christianity was a cult of suffering. Nietzsche's deteriorating health prompted him to request to be relieved of his duties at the University of Basel in May 1879. By now in his mid-30s, his thinking had evolved considerably during his years at Basel, though over the course of the next decade, he would have to eke out an existence as an independent philosopher with a pension of 3,000 Swiss francs a year from the university and occasional financial support from friends and family. However, despite his poor health and the manner in which his work in the 1870s had strongly divided opinion, Nietzsche was about to embark on the most productive period of his life, as the liberation from his academic duties freed him to research and write to an unprecedented extent. By the autumn of 1879, he had already put together another collection of free-thinking aphorisms, entitled The Wanderer and His Shadow. In this, Nietzsche denounced the promotion of abstract concepts such as the salvation of the soul, arguing that human beings should not be troubled by metaphysical considerations. Addressing an age-old question about the state of nature, he attacks Jean-Jacques Rousseau's notion that man is born free but everywhere is in chains, arguing that rather than voluntarily giving up part of their freedoms for the social good, human communities evolved in response to external threats, and the earliest forms of justice were no more than legalized systems of revenge. By giving his book the title The Wanderer and His Shadow, Nietzsche used his aphorisms to explore positive and negative aspects of the same issue. For instance, addressing the impacts of war, Nietzsche asserted that while war was clearly a destructive force, it can also provide the necessary catalyst to rejuvenate stagnant communities and resolve long-standing tensions within them. These views were often controversial, but many of the ideas outlined in The Wanderer and His Shadow are now widely incorporated into the field of anthropology and the study of early human societies. The winter of 1879 proved disastrous for Nietzsche's health, and he spent 1880 on the move, seeking more amenable climates. In February 1880, he went to the northern Italian lakes, where he met up with Heinrich Koselleck and accompanied him to Venice. Nietzsche enjoyed Venice in the company of his young friend, whose support in transcribing Nietzsche's barely legible drafts into a fine copy proved indispensable. But the summer heat compelled him to move to the fashionable spa town of Marienbad, now in the Czech Republic. After returning to Naumburg in September, he returned to Italy in October to preempt the onset of winter and settled down in Genoa. Here Nietzsche was prodigiously busy, and by February 1881 he had completed his draft of Morgenröte, or Morning Glow, which was published in June. While Nietzsche had high hopes for the book, it would prove to be one of his lesser-known works, though it allowed him to further develop his ideas about Christianity's harmful impact on human development, while expressing his appreciation for Eastern religions, in particular Buddhism, which had largely cast aside the need for gods in favor of a quest for the spiritual fulfillment of the individual. January 1882 saw Nietzsche in unusually good health, and he was glad to have the company of Paul Rée, who had brought a typewriter with him to help Nietzsche with his work. Typewriters had only really become commercially available from the late 1860s onwards, and Nietzsche, who was trying to use one in a sustained manner for the first time, initially struggled to operate the machine, straining his eyes to make sure that he was pressing the right key. Now in his late 30s, Nietzsche made the light-hearted suggestion that he might need a wife, a subject that he had occasionally discussed before with Paul Rée and Malvida von Meisenburg during their time in Sorrento. After spending 5 weeks in Genoa with Nietzsche, Rée had continued his journey to Rome to stay with Meisenburg, in whose salon he encountered Lou Salome, a 21-year-old Russian-born poet whose iconoclastic opinions reflected her disillusionment at the religious and moral instruction she received as a student of theology. Rée insisted that Nietzsche ought to meet this extraordinary prodigy, and after a brief stay in Messina in Sicily, Nietzsche arrived at Rome in mid-April. In spite of their rather awkward initial encounters in Rome, Nietzsche was soon impressed by Salome's intellect. In Salome, Nietzsche believed that he had found a young female disciple who could support his work. Although Salome later claimed that Nietzsche had proposed to her during a third meeting in Lausanne in early May, Nietzsche insisted that he was only after intellectual companionship, in contrast to Rée, who addressed incessant letters to her in distinctly romantic terms. In a plan devised by Salome, the three intended to live together in a philosophical commune in Vienna. To his skeptical friends, Nietzsche declared his intention to train Salome as his intellectual successor and preemptively denied that he had any romantic interest in her. Nietzsche had arranged for his sister Elisabeth and Salome to meet in Bayreuth in July for a performance of Wagner's opera Parsifal, based on the Arthurian knight Percival's quest for the Holy Grail, one which Nietzsche hated due to its Christian inspiration. Despite their outward display of friendship, Elisabeth Nietzsche was irritated by the young Russian. In the meantime, Nietzsche had added to his body of work with Joyous Science, in which he endorsed Charles Darwin's views on biological evolution, which were still enormously controversial over 20 years after The Origin of Species, had first been published. At the same time, Nietzsche challenged the Darwinian concept of the survival of the fittest. Following this logic, the purpose of humans and all other animals was solely to survive. But Nietzsche observed that many individuals who had made the greatest contributions to human culture, such as the Renaissance artist Raphael or the composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, had died young without leaving any heirs. Nietzsche argued that human existence was both comic and tragic. The comic aspect was due to the vanity of short-lived humans who believed that they could master nature, while the tragic element came from the recognition that humans are an infinitesimally small part of the cosmos. Near the end of the book, Nietzsche issued a call to his readers to wage an intellectual war on behalf of science against religion. Joyous Science is a peculiar work in many ways, one which tried to apply the evolutionary biology of Darwin to a new theory of cultural evolution. Although Nietzsche had called his book Joyous Science, he concluded that the tragic aspects of human existence would always prevail. Nevertheless, his encounters with Lou Salome had inspired within him a sense of optimism about life. In August 1882, the two spent 3 weeks in philosophical discussions in the Tautenberg forest in Saxony, which Nietzsche hailed as one of the happiest times of his life. Arguments did occur, though, with his sister and mother about the propriety of his relationship with Salome, which led Nietzsche to leave Naumburg for Leipzig. There, the already precarious foundations of his triangular relationship began to crumble, as a jealous Ray resented Nietzsche's insistence on spending time alone with Salome, while the young and strong-minded Russian had no intention of submitting herself to Nietzsche's intellectual control. Nietzsche also admitted privately in his notebooks around this time that his desire for Salome had assumed a physical dimension. He was consequently immensely upset when the relationship between them all began to collapse in the weeks that followed. Plunged into a deep depression and resorting to taking growing quantities of opium to treat both his physical ailments and his emotional pain, Nietzsche continued an acrimonious correspondence in the months that followed with his erstwhile companions from his retreat at Rapallo in Italy, all to no avail as they drifted apart. As emotionally turbulent a period as this was for Nietzsche, it proved an intellectually productive one, as he began working on what is often deemed to be his most important work, Thus Spake Zarathustra. In this, he sought to establish a new philosophical framework of his own, independent of the influence of Schopenhauer, Kant, or any other philosopher. This singularly Nietzschean philosophy was expressed via the mouthpiece of the ancient Persian philosopher Zoroaster, who gave his name to Zoroastrianism, the world's first monotheistic faith, one which had flourished in Mesopotamia and Persia in the first millennium BC, and in which the creator god, Ahura Mazda, was involved in an eternal struggle with the demon Ahriman. Although Nietzsche rejected the dichotomy of good and evil introduced by Zoroastrianism, one which had clearly influenced the development of Christianity, he saw Zoroaster as a prophet who had challenged the status quo, hence his motives for expressing some of his own philosophical ideas through the mouthpiece of the Persian prophet. Nietzsche wrote the first part of Zarathustra within the space of 10 days in late January 1883. A couple of weeks later, he learned that Richard Wagner had died unexpectedly in Venice. They had not seen each other in over 6 years after an acrimonious divergence of views in the mid-1870s, though Nietzsche continued to revere elements of the great composer's work. During a visit to Rome in April 1883, Nietzsche reconciled with his sister Elisabeth, whom he had earlier blamed for the wrecking of his plans with Salome. By June, he was back at his favorite Swiss mountain retreat of Sils Maria, where he expressed his anger at his Leipzig publisher Ernst Schmeitzner for delaying the publication of the first part of Zarathustra. Nietzsche speculated that Zoroaster's declaration in the book that, quote, "God is dead," surely one of the most famous lines of modern philosophy, had led Schmeitzner's printer to sit on the manuscript and delay its publication. The text was paradoxical. On the one hand, Nietzsche argued that the advent of science and modernity was leading to a growing secularism, one which would eventually lead to the death of Christianity. Yet on the other hand, Zarathustra is evidently framed in the text as a parallel to Jesus Christ, and Nietzsche even referred to his book as a fifth gospel. These contradictions can be explained when we see that Nietzsche was arguing that man was now moving to a new stage of evolution after the religiosity of the past, one in which a new Übermensch, Overman or Superman, one based on rationality and a higher culture, would emerge. By July, Nietzsche had completed the second part of Zarathustra, consisting of 22 further discourses in which he went further than ever in denouncing the hypocrisy of Christians seeking self-negating virtuousness for the sake of a heavenly kingdom. Nietzsche began to develop the idea of the will to power, substituting Schopenhauer's image of nature as a struggle for survival with a struggle for mastery, arguing that no relationship between two humans is without a desire to gain control over the other. As he elaborated on the concept, Nietzsche argued that Christianity had only been able to succeed because the emperors at the heart of the Roman Empire had realized in the 4th century that adopting the new religion served their material purposes well, and that the Church soon became estranged from the moral message of Christ as the bishops of Rome sought ever greater power in medieval times. What was needed was a new morality entirely. In the third part of Zarathustra, completed in early 1884 during a stay in Venice, Nietzsche portrays Zoroaster returning to the mountains, where he draws the depressing conclusion that since time is infinite, everything in life is an eternal recurrence of what has already happened before, and will happen again, and that humanity as a collective would never fully evolve, though in the end, Nietzsche's Zoroaster or Zarathustra still finds comfort in the notion of eternity. Although Nietzsche intended this to be the final part of a Zarathustra trilogy, in January 1885 he wrote another 20 Zarathustra scenes of such an explicitly sacrilegious nature that he decided to limit the print run of this fourth part to 40 copies that he distributed among a select circle of friends. These exclusive copies were printed by the Leipzig printer Konstantin Naumann, who had also printed the first 3 volumes at Schmeitzner's request. By this point, Nietzsche had broken off with Schmeitzner. Meanwhile, Nietzsche received news that his sister Elisabeth was planning to marry Dr. Bernhard Förster, a Wagner-file teacher who was planning to found a German nationalist community in South America after his radical opinions cost him his teaching jobs. While both Nietzsche and his mother were opposed to the match, the couple married in May and would leave for Paraguay in early 1886. After completing Zarathustra, Nietzsche decided to return to writing more conventional philosophical treatises without using ancient religious philosophers as his mouthpiece. By March 1886, he had completed Beyond Good and Evil, a work he would struggle to find a publisher for and which he eventually had published at his own expense on the first print run. There were reasons for this. Zarathustra had not sold well, and hundreds of copies of it and Nietzsche's other works were languishing in storage. Publishers were reluctant to take on his books, fearing losses. The stock of his earlier books was eventually bought by the music publisher Ernst Wilhelm Fritsch. Despite his poor sales figures, Nietzsche ordered 1,250 copies of Beyond Good and Evil, regarding it as a concise statement of his thinking. This latest book was another attack on the forces of democratization and egalitarianism, which Nietzsche saw as evolving harmfully out of Christianity. Nietzsche took a stand against these developments, claiming that a great many elements of human progress and cultural creativity had taken place in aristocratic societies. Building on his belief that morality was an artificial construct designed to control people within society, Nietzsche distinguished between what he termed a slave morality and a master morality. Given his optimism about the book's potential commercial appeal, Nietzsche was deeply disappointed to learn in February 1887 that only 65 copies of Beyond Good and Evil had been sold. Among the few readers who appreciated the book was Meta von Salis, a Swiss writer and historian who had just become the first woman in Switzerland to receive a doctorate. Nietzsche and Salis had known each other since 1884 and became close friends. In the summer of 1887, Salis visited Nietzsche in Silz-Maria, where, in an effort to encourage sales of Beyond Good and Evil, he began work on a follow-up volume entitled On the Genealogy of Morality. Drawing on his training in philology, Nietzsche observed that the word for good in many ancient languages derived from words denoting nobility and bravery, while bad related to words such as common or lowly. According to Nietzsche, the process of linguistic transformation began first with the ancient priestly classes of the Levant and wider parts of the Middle East, where civilization had first flourished. For these people, purity and faith were more important than nobility or courage. Out of this tradition, there later emerged the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, who encouraged humanity to sympathize with the poor and lowly in exchange for spiritual comfort. For Nietzsche, it was the warrior class of Germanic and Scandinavian conquerors who prevented Europe from becoming a Christian theocracy after the fall of the Roman Empire. Although they adopted Christianity, the new kings established an aristocratic hierarchy that was inspired by Roman rule. However, the Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution saw a return of the slave morality in places like Calvinist Geneva in the 16th century. While many individuals will disagree with Nietzsche's arguments about morality in it, in terms of the rigor of his analysis in tracing how Judeo-Christian morality developed over a period of 3 millennia, On the Genealogy of Morality is one of Nietzsche's most significant works. Throughout the creative process for these philosophical texts, Nietzsche continued to suffer from frequent bouts of ill health. Nevertheless, during a stay in Nice in the early months of 1888, he experienced his best health for several years and conceived a 4-volume work entitled The Will to Power as the crowning statement of his philosophy. Yet as early as March, he recognized that the plan was too ambitious and abandoned it. By that time, he was searching for a new refuge and decided to head to Turin. The city's climate and its music culture delighted Nietzsche, who remained for 3 months until leaving for Silz-Maria. In a burst of creativity, Nietzsche wrote The Case of Wagner, a polemical critique in which he cast his erstwhile musical idol as a symbol of decadence and decay in European music and society. He continued with The Twilight of the Idols, a series of light-hearted attacks on all the philosophical and religious doctrines Nietzsche opposed, with a title parodying the final opera in Wagner's Ring cycle, The Twilight of the Gods. This was followed by The Antichrist, an investigation into the origins of Christianity, one in which Nietzsche argued that while Jesus, whose kingdom of God was both in the future and in the present, had encouraged his followers to live free from hatred and resentment, the early Christians imposed a doctrine of judgment that used the concepts of heaven and hell as a system of rewards and punishments. Nietzsche compared Jesus' original teachings to those of Buddhism, remarking that Buddhism makes no promises but keeps them. Christianity promises everything but keeps nothing. Nietzsche had returned to Turin in September. To mark the occasion of his 44th birthday on the 15th of October 1888, he decided to write an autobiographical work under the title Ecce Homo, or Behold the Man, the words attributed to Jesus' executioner, Pontius Pilate, as he presented him to the Jewish crowd. In this short volume, Nietzsche hoped to clear up misunderstandings about his work to date. Under provocative chapter titles such as Why Am I So Wise and Why I Write Such Good Books, Nietzsche explored his upbringing, his poor health, and the thinkers and artists of the past who had inspired him, both positively and negatively. In his defense of his own work, Nietzsche suffused the text with exaggeration, claiming that his Zarathustra was superior to anything that Goethe, Shakespeare, or Dante had ever produced. Ecce Homo should not be read literally in all places, and clearly, whether in his boastful passages about his literary prowess or in the sarcastic titles of the chapters, Nietzsche was being humorous. Having written Ecce Homo in the space of 3 weeks, he returned to the split between himself and Wagner many years earlier, something which still clearly troubled him deeply. Compiling extracts from his previous work, he argued that it was not he who had changed his mind about German culture back in the mid-1770s, but Wagner, in becoming increasingly nationalistic and pandering to the popular mood of the day. Nietzsche's burst of immense activity in the 1880s was soon to come to an end. At the end of the year, his mental state suddenly deteriorated. He became prone to fits of anger, and in his delusions of grandeur, he wrote letters addressed to Kaiser Wilhelm II and Bismarck denouncing their doctrines, while in correspondence to friends, he wrote about forming an anti-German league and bringing down the German Empire. In a letter to Meta von Salis, dated the 3rd of January 1889, Nietzsche declared that God is on earth, and claimed to have imprisoned the Pope and ordered Kaiser Wilhelm and Bismarck to be shot. According to an account published after his death, Nietzsche's condition became public when he saw a horse being flogged by its driver in the streets of Turin and ran to protect it, before collapsing at its feet. Clearly, he was deeply unwell, and both those who argue that he was syphilitic or suffering from a brain tumor agree that whatever his condition was, it became much worse in the course of 1888 and 1889. As news of his erratic behavior spread, Nietzsche's family hurried to have him brought back to Switzerland. After a series of medical examinations, which determined that Nietzsche may have been suffering from syphilis contracted as a young man, the philosopher was transferred to the care of his mother, Franziska, in Naumburg. For a year or two, Nietzsche could still string together a few coherent sentences in conversation, but over time his condition worsened irreversibly. The fate of Nietzsche's final unpublished works was still up in the air until 1892, when Elisabeth gave Naumann the right to publish a second edition of her brother's complete works, edited by Heinrich Koselitz, who used the pseudonym Peter Gast that Nietzsche bestowed upon him for his musical compositions. Elisabeth's ill-fated Paraguayan adventure had come to an end, and its failure had caused her husband to take his own life in despair. In 1893, she decided to take control of the whole process, sidelining Koselitz and writing her own biography of her brother, in which she resumed her vengeful attacks against Lou Salome, blaming her in part for her brother's psychological collapse. In 1895, after an argument with her mother about the publication of the Antichrist, Elisabeth brought out her mother's rights to future royalties. When Franziska died in April 1897, Elisabeth moved her brother to the Villa Silberblick near Weimar, where she received admirers of Nietzsche's works and took them to see him despite his condition. On the 25th of August 1900, a couple of months shy of his 56th birthday, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche died at Villa Silberblick, following a heart attack. 3 days later, he was buried beside his father at the parish church in Röcken, despite the protests of the vicar. Following a tumultuous life in which he struggled against persistent illness to become firstly a distinguished academic and secondly an original thinker, who sought to dismantle conventional morality, the iconoclastic anti-Christian philosopher found his final resting place in a Christian graveyard. In a further irony, just as Nietzsche argued that Jesus' followers distorted his teaching after his death, Nietzsche's own thinking was misrepresented by imperialists, communists, and fascists who adapted his concepts of will to power, master morality, and the Superman for their own ends. The worst culprit of all was Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, who promoted her brother as a German nationalist and anti-Semite, and was received by Adolf Hitler on several occasions before her death at the age of 88 in 1935. Both Wagner and Nietzsche had their work exploited by the Nazis towards their own political ends in the 1930s and early 1940s. There are very few philosophers in human history who have left behind as contentious a legacy as Friedrich Nietzsche did. On the one hand, he has been rightly praised as one of the most startlingly original thinkers of modern times. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the conclusions he drew, there is no doubt that the arguments which he put forward in books like The Birth of Tragedy, Beyond Good and Evil, Thus Spake Zarathustra, and the essays in Untimely Meditations were extremely novel in their approach. However, many people have found his rejection of the ideas of social egalitarianism and his fundamental rejection of conventional Western morality unpalatable. That being said, the attribution of fascist views to him is not accurate. Moreover, even if one finds his arguments unpalatable, there is no denying their influence. His commentaries on the so-called death of God in an increasingly secular age foreshadowed the decline of Christian churches in 20th century Europe and laid the groundwork for much of the existential philosophy of the post-war era. Many of Nietzsche's arguments about the evolution of society have also been absorbed to varying degrees into the fields of history, anthropology, and sociology. And that is perhaps the most striking thing about Nietzsche, the sheer breadth of his work. It went far beyond philosophical inquiry to embrace history, anthropology, philology, religion, literary and artistic criticism, musical theory, and much more besides. Thus, whether one loves or loathes him, there is no ignoring Nietzsche in modern scholarship. What do you think of Friedrich Nietzsche? Was he a profound and original thinker who encouraged humanity to seek improvement and scale new heights of cultural and intellectual achievement? Or was his complex philosophy the product of a tortured mind that was degenerating in many ways in the 1880s? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Karl Marx was born on the 5th of May 1818 in the town of Trier in western Germany, not far from the border with Luxembourg today. In the first half of the 19th century, this town was in the midst of a large section of the German Rhineland, which had come under the rule of the Kingdom of Prussia in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Marx's father was Heinrich Marx, a German lawyer of Jewish heritage, whose own father was a rabbi. His original name was Herschel Levy, but he changed it right around the time of Karl's birth, after renouncing his Judaism and converting to Lutheran Christianity in the face of the anti-Semitism which was mounting in Europe in the 19th century. He was a successful lawyer, and the family owned some vineyards from which they acquired an additional income. Karl's mother was Henrietta, a Dutch-born woman who had married Heinrich in 1814. The marriage resulted in 9 children, Karl being the third. 2 of these would die in infancy, and as a result, Karl grew up with 6 siblings. The Marx household enjoyed a relatively affluent life when Karl was growing up. When he was still an infant, they moved to a 10-room townhouse in Trier, a clear sign of their upper middle-class economic status. It was a secular household, interested in the ideas of rationalism and liberalism that had permeated Europe during the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Karl was home-schooled by his well-educated father until he was 12 years of age. Thereafter, he was sent to a school in Trier run by Hugh Wittenbach, a figure who ran into considerable controversy not long after, owing to his radical teaching curriculum, one which led the Prussian authorities to intervene to actively change the methods being used and the texts being read at the gymnasium. Other than these issues, Marx's childhood was seemingly fairly uneventful. He rarely reflected on his younger years, in any of his own writings. Marx's life and political philosophy were shaped by the events which were just beginning to accelerate on the European continent as he was growing up as a child. The Industrial Revolution had begun in England back in the 1770s, when proto-industrialists, specifically ones who controlled the country's textile trade, began to realize that they could substantially increase their profits if they introduced machines to carry out the weaving process that had traditionally been done by hand, and then that they could engage in what we now call economies of scale if they placed large numbers of these machines in one building, what would soon come to be called a factory. Soon as steam engines were introduced into the mix to accelerate the production process, the demand for coal to fuel them ballooned. This was how the Industrial Revolution began. It did not spread quickly to Europe, though. The rest of the continent was slow to absorb the new ideas, a lethargy that was augmented by the unrest created by the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars between 1792 and 1815. However, from the 1820s onwards, many countries on the continent began to industrialize at speed. The Low Countries came first, followed by parts of northern France and western Germany, particularly in the Rhineland and Ruhr regions, where coal and mineral wealth were abundant. Marx was thus born into a region that was emerging as one of the main centers of the Industrial Revolution on the continent from the 1820s onwards, as he was growing up there. The Industrial Revolution was a poisoned chalice in many respects. It was one of the key social and economic phenomena which created the modern world. The economies of the European states and other Western countries in the Americas, like the United States, Canada, and Argentina, began to experience historically unprecedented growth as a result of it, and the material attainment of people in countries like England and Germany became greater than any society in human history had ever seen. Our lives of convenience and comfort in the 21st century are, in many ways, the byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. Yet it came with its own strains. In medieval and early modern times, most people were agricultural workers. They worked hard at certain times of the year, specifically during the sowing season and the harvest, but for much of the year they had little work to do. Life was precarious and people were quite poor in the main, yet it was also not overtly onerous at times. Industrialization changed that. Reforms to how agriculture was practiced and booming populations forced large throngs of people into emergent industrial cities like Manchester, Sheffield, Newcastle, Liège, and Aachen that had been minor towns a generation or two earlier. There they were paid poorly to work extremely long hours in factories and mines, or laying down railway tracks and building steamships from the 1830s and 1840s onwards. Adult men were expected to work up to 70 hours a week in some scenarios, and women and children as young as 8 or 9 were working 55 or 60 hours a week. When these urban workers, or the proletariat as figures like Marx would soon term them, went home, it was to cramped tenements that were plagued by outbreaks of the Blue Death, the cholera epidemic that ravaged Europe's industrial cities between the 1830s and the 1890s. This is the situation which needs to be borne in mind when assessing Marx's subsequent career. In 1835, after turning 17 in May of that year, Marx was sent to study at the University of Bonn, not far to the north of his native Trier. A clash with his father over what the future course of his studies and career might be led to Karl, who was more inclined towards philosophy, partly studying law. His attentions never focused on it. Instead, he was more interested in extracurricular activities such as his membership of the Trier Tavern Club, the purpose of which can be assumed from its name. Within a year, his parents, exasperated by his seeming waywardness, insisted that Karl transfer to the University of Berlin, a more prestigious and a stricter university. He would study here for the next several years, for a BA and then a more advanced degree. These were formative times for him. His father died in 1838, and despite their disagreements, the pair had been relatively close. Heinrich's death left an emotional and material void. The surviving members of the large Marx family now suddenly finding themselves with a precarious financial future. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Karl experimented with various different career options, for a time trying his hand at writing fictional novels and plays in the late 1830s, though he soon abandoned these literary aspirations. Ultimately, Marx was drawn to the philosophical thought of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel while studying at Berlin. Hegel had only recently died in the Prussian capital in 1831, and there were many figures at the University of Berlin who had known and worked with him. His letters were also being edited there, making study of Hegel's thought somewhat fashionable at the time. Marx was soon a member of the Young Hegelians, a group of students and radicals who were critical of the conservative Prussian government and who believed, in line with Hegel's thought, that the liberty of the individual and the creation of a more permissive society were social goods. It was through his study of Hegel and association with the Young Hegelians that Marx ended up beginning a doctoral dissertation at the University of Vienna under the supervision of Bruno Bauer, a former student of Hegel's. This was entitled "The Difference Between the Democritian and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature," and involved a comparative analysis of the work of Democritus and Epicurus, two ancient Greek philosophers of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, one of whom, Democritus, had also been a formative figure in the early history of physics, hypothesizing the existence of atoms, while Epicurus was the founder of the Greek philosophical school of Epicureanism. Marx defended the thesis in 1841. Following the completion of his studies at Berlin and Jena, Marx was giving considerable thought to pursuing an academic career, and had taught occasionally by then. However, the environment within the lands of the Kingdom of Prussia was far from conducive to this, and the Young Hegelians had been monitored by the authorities owing to the perception of them as being politically radical. He consequently decided to become a political writer, yet soon fell foul of the press censors in Berlin. With this, realizing that there was little room for the free expression of his ideas in the lands of the Kingdom of Prussia, Marx left for Paris in October 1843. It was the beginning of a period of some 6 years in which he moved around quite a lot. 2 years in the French capital, for instance, were brought to an end in 1845 after Marx and a cohort of other radical political writers were expelled after the French government was requested to do so by the Prussians on account of their having published several articles that were critical of the Prussian government. This led Marx to Brussels, the capital of the Kingdom of Belgium, one of Europe's newest independent nations, having only emerged after centuries of Burgundian, Spanish and Austrian rule following the Belgian Revolution of 1830. He would work from Brussels for the next 3 years, before also being expelled from there for breaking a promise not to engage in subversive activity. A brief stint would follow in Cologne, before Marx made London his home in 1849. By the time Marx adopted the lifestyle of a nomadic political writer in 1843, he was a married man.
His wife was Jenny von Westphalen, a member of a family of the lower aristocracy in Western Germany. She was 4 years older than Karl, and they had known each other in Trier as children and as teenagers. They later resumed their acquaintance and married in 1843, despite the reservations of her family about marrying the thickly bearded bohemian and seemingly dissolute political writer. Such relationships could be complicated. Karl would remain on good terms with Jenny's brother Ferdinand, who served as Minister of the Interior of Prussia for much of the 1850s, a man who oversaw policies which were the antithesis of everything Marx advocated for. The marriage would result in 7 children, though 4 would die in infancy and childhood, a very high percentage at a time when infant mortality was rapidly declining owing to medical advancements. The 3 that lived into their adult years were all daughters: Jenny, Laura, and Eleanor. Each would become political actors, writers, and socialists. The Marx family life was chaotic. They were never wealthy or even comfortable, living in a 2-room house for many years in London, while they spent many years moving around, with Karl renting homes under aliases to avoid political interference in his actions. He could be viewed as a neglectful father who favoured advancing his own writing career over the material well-being of his family, though he was otherwise written about by those who knew the family as a doting father, and his daughter's later decisions speak to an affinity for their father's work. Rumours of an affair later in Marx's life with the family housekeeper Helena, one that produced an illegitimate son, Frederick de Muth, have never been substantiated and remain largely hearsay. These itinerant years, moving between Berlin, Paris, Brussels, and Cologne in the 1840s, were some of the most productive of Marx's life. He composed numerous books and articles during this time, although he could not acquire a publisher for many of them on account of their content and his reputation as someone who the Prussian censors and others abroad were watching. These ranged over a wide range of subjects. A critique of Hegel's philosophy of right was, as the title clearly indicates, a reflection on elements of Hegel's philosophical ideas. Other work assessed the philosophical views of James Mill and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, 2 relatively contemporary philosophers from Scotland and France. A piece entitled On the Jewish Question was published in 1844 and reflected on the issue of Jewish liberties in the Kingdom of Prussia. It has strangely led to accusations of anti-Semitism being pointed at Marx, despite the fact that he was himself Jewish, albeit the son of a secular Jewish father who had converted to Christianity for broadly social and economic reasons. Finally, in 1847, Marx delivered a lecture which was later published under the title of Wage, Labour and Capital. Here he began to lay out his ideas concerning material progress and how industrialization and the accumulation of capital were driving class conflict across Europe. Throughout these years, Marx was beginning his long partnership with Friedrich Engels. Engels was a fellow German. He was 2.5 years younger than Marx and hailed from a considerably wealthier family. His father, Friedrich Sr., was a textile businessman who owned mills and factories in the town of Barmen in western Germany and also in Salford, a suburb of the industrial metropolis that Manchester in the north of England had become on the back of its central role in the cotton industry during the Industrial Revolution. Friedrich Jr.'s parents had hoped that he would follow in the family business, but by the time he was 20 years old, he was already demonstrating a critical attitude towards his family's wealth. In 1841, he was called out for mandatory military service in Prussia, something which Marx had been excused on the basis of poor health. In Berlin, Engels began attending lectures at the University of Berlin, became interested in the work of Hegel, and later bonded with Marx over shared interests and political views after they first met late in 1842. They would collaborate on a huge number of co-authored works, though Engels was a substantial writer in his own right. His 1845 book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, is, for instance, considered a major reflection on the poverty and squalor that was attendant on industrialization in the middle of the 19th century. Many decades later, it was also owing to Engels that the second and third volumes of Marx's foremost work, Das Kapital, were published posthumously. Marx and Engels were not just co-authors of several works together. They were also allies in political action. One such early endeavor was the formation of the Communist Correspondence Committee. This was an organization formed of individuals like them, with similar views on politics, economics, and society, who lived in Brussels, London, Paris, and Cologne, 4 cities in relatively close proximity to each other in Western Europe, between which members of the committee could exchange letters speedily. The name communist was adopted as it had come into vogue in parts of Western and Central Europe in the late 1830s and 1840s to describe individuals whose political views were akin to the radical left wing of the Jacobins clubs that had led the French Revolution through the first half of the 1790s. They viewed themselves as being politically sympathetic to the sans-culottes of Paris during the Revolution, the working-class Parisians who had been responsible, amongst other things, for the storming of the Bastille prison and the decision to remove the royal family from Versailles and place them under virtual house arrest in Paris in 1789. This was in part the origin of the term communist, though over time it would also take on the additional meaning of someone who is in favor of the communal ownership of goods within a society. The Communist Correspondence Committee soon joined into a union with a similar group known as the League of the Just, after a conference in London in the early summer of 1847. The new entity was termed the Communist League. From its inception, Marx and Engels were prominent figures in the Communist League. They attended a second meeting of its membership in London in late November and early December 1847. It was decided there that Marx and his colleague would draw up a manifesto that would outline what the Communist League sought to achieve. The work progressed quickly. Over the space of about 6 weeks in the winter of 1847, Marx drafted what would become the Communist Manifesto, and then had Engels review it. The writing process was chaotic, and Marx procrastinated on it in January 1848. Eventually, he finished the typescript in early February and sent it to London, where the publishing team for the Communist League sped it through publication. It was published in the English capital late in February 1848. Though the text was attributed to both Marx and Engels, most assessments of the writing process tend to argue that Marx was the primary author, with Engels offering only minimal interventions, albeit the general tenor and spirit of what was contained in it had been forged in conversations between the duo over half a decade prior to Marx putting pen to paper. The Communist Manifesto, for such a consequential text in modern world history, is actually very short, more like a pamphlet than a book. It stretches to just around 14,000 words in modern editions, depending on the editorial conventions used. Marx immediately set out his view that history is a story of struggles between different economic and social classes. In ancient Rome, This was between patricians, plebeians, and slaves. In the medieval era, it was between lords and knights and the serfs that worked their fields. Now, in the industrial age, Marx asserted the clash was between the bourgeois factory owners and professional classes who ran society and the growing proletariat of urban workers. He castigated the changes industrialization had inflicted on society, stating, quote, "The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. Everywhere, the bourgeois monopoly on industrial power and capitalism was creating misery in places where material progress should have been improving people's lives." He was especially critical of the manner in which child labour in the factories and mines had proliferated. The solution, Marx argued, was held by the Communist League and other groups like it. Private property ought to be abolished, and henceforth factories, mines, shipyards, farms and other economic and social utilities should be held under communal state ownership. With this done, collective decisions could be made by the proletariat to expand access to education, create better working conditions, and allow for an equal share in the benefits of industrial growth and material progress. Marx closed his pamphlet with a famous phrase, which was the slogan of the Communist League: "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." The Communist Manifesto has become one of the most controversial texts ever written. This is in sharp contrast to how uncontroversial it really was at the time. It was basically the articulation of the policy platform of a new political movement. Political groups and parties publish policy documents all the time. Revolutionary documents and idealist political statements of this kind were also hardly novel. In England, in the Civil War period of the 1640s, a wide range of revolutionary schemes to reorganize the entire foundation of society had been devised. One figure from that era, John Milton, a political idealist, had influenced Marx considerably in the views he professed in his work Paradise Lost. The very concept of establishing a United States of America out of the British 13 colonies lying between New Hampshire and Georgia was radical when the Founding Fathers devised it in 1776. Perhaps most importantly, political treatises which argued in favour of political and social utopias of the kind outlined in the Communist Manifesto had been produced as far back as the 4th century BC, when the Athenian philosopher and political scientist Plato composed The Republic, a lengthy commentary on the ideal state. Plato had argued in favour of something akin to the communal ownership of goods, and one could also argue that the English Lord Chancellor of the reign of King Henry VIII, Sir Thomas More, had offered up proto-communist ideas in his famous treatise Utopia. In this regard, the text was hardly a completely new departure in European political thought. It has been speculated that Marx was largely drunk while writing the Communist Manifesto, something which would be quite ironic, given that this short treatise would go on to become one of the most influential texts ever written. Part of the reason he had procrastinated in finishing it in January 1848 was that he had headed to Ghent to establish a branch of the Communist League there, and spent a week and a half in the smaller Belgian city, much of it spent intoxicated, before returning to Brussels, where an ultimatum from the League headquarters in London to finish the manifesto was waiting for him. He then rushed it off over the next few days. That Marx was imbibing throughout this period was unquestionable. The available evidence certainly suggests that he met the definition of a high-functioning alcoholic.
He began drinking a lot during his early student days in Bonn, and continued the habit for the next half a century. This was not the average diet of almost perpetual beer consumption that characterized European life in early modern and pre-modern times, especially in cities where drinking alcohol was safer than consuming disease-ridden water. But instead, Marx had a penchant for wine and liquor, all in tandem with a rich diet and cigars. By the late 1840s, by which time he was entering his 30s, he had a growing range of health problems, some probably related to liver disease.
Even as the Communist Manifesto was being published in London at the end of February 1848, a wave of revolutionary fervour was sweeping across Europe. This began in the city of Palermo, on the island of Sicily, in January 1848, and rapidly spread across the continent. By March and April, major revolts were underway in places like Poland, Hungary, France, much of Germany, Denmark, the Swiss Confederacy, and Ireland, while virtually every other country witnessed popular protest, if not full-blown revolts. The revolutions of 1848, or the springtime of the people as it would become known, led to wide-ranging political changes in countries like France, Hungary, and Italy, and threatened to lead to the overthrow of entire governments in Germany and other regions. In the aftermath of the revolutions, there were crackdowns on perceived political extremism. Marx, who had just moved back to Cologne after coming under pressure from the Belgian government owing to his political views in the midst of the revolutions sweeping the continent, soon also experienced harassment from the Prussian government on account of his role in the Communist League, and was eventually asked to leave the kingdom entirely. This was the background against which the Marx family relocated to London. Marx would spend the rest of his life based out of the British capital, in a country which was more liberal-minded than virtually any other country in Europe at that time, with extensive censorship practiced in other capitals of a kind which would have precluded him from getting his work published. In London, Marx was inspired enough by the events of 1848 and 1849 across Europe, even though the revolutions had generally ended in suppression and violent crackdowns, to begin now researching and writing some retrospective commentaries on that other great European revolutionary movement, the French Revolution of 1789, and its aftermath in the 1790s. For communists and for left-leaning socialists of all hues, the French Revolution was one of the defining events of human history. Where the American Revolution had been primarily driven by well-to-do urban bourgeois types and wealthy plantation owners, the French insurrection had been led to a significant extent by the sans-culottes, urban workers of Paris, and the Jacobin clubs of radical revolutionaries. It had been both a movement to overthrow the ancien régime of crown, aristocracy, and church, and an effort to establish a completely new type of society. Marx and many others wished to launch a new revolution of this kind. To that end, from 1849 into the early 1850s, he wrote extensively in an effort to analyze what went wrong in France in the 1790s to foil the revolution and lead it into the monarchy of Napoleon Bonaparte, contrasting it with the recent rise to power of Charles-Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew, as President of France during the Revolution of 1848. He would subsequently proclaim himself to be Napoleon III, a new emperor of the French. Marx was clear. The bourgeois had manipulated the French proletariat in a manner which led them to accept an abandonment of the revolution in 1799 and the acceptance of Bonaparte as first consul and then Emperor of the French in 1804. Similar principles had recently led to the undermining of the 1848 revolution in France and the rise of another Bonaparte to power. Marx might have been anxious to comment on and analyze the various revolutionary movements across the continent, but he also had to make a living in London after he moved there. He acquired some work as a journalist, writing as a London-based correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune, while also writing occasionally for several other publications. Much of this involved digesting British political developments and making them intelligible for an American audience, especially developments at the British Parliament at Westminster during a very busy time in the country's legislative history. It was precarious work, and Marx was often only paid for articles that were accepted for publication, making his income stream unstable. The Marx family were not poverty-stricken, yet they hardly lived an affluent life in London, and Karl would have had difficulties in continuing his unpaid research and writing had it not been for financial support from Engels, whose family's wealth provided him with an independent income stream. Marx was also interested in these years in London in the ongoing political tensions in the United States, ones which focused on the issue of slavery and which would eventually spill over into the American Civil War in 1861. This was based on his observations of the fractious state of US politics in the 1850s, and then the final descent into conflict after the election of Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 presidential election. However, his collection of essays on the topic, published as a series of articles for the New York Daily Tribune and Die Presse in Vienna between 1860 and 1868, also attempted a wider analysis of the economic divisions between the free northern states and the slave-owning southern states, which had caused the conflict in the first place. Marx was firmly on the side of the Union in the war and the anti-slavery cause, so much so that it ultimately cost him his job writing for the New York Daily Tribune after the board of the paper decided on a markedly neutral stance in the war in 1863, arguing that a peaceful resolution between North and South, one that might allow for a retention of slavery of some kind in places like Virginia and the Carolinas, was possible. Marx withdrew from the paper at that juncture and acquired other work with Die Presse and other outlets. Luckily, by then, one of his other books, a contribution to the critique of political economy, published in 1859, was selling well enough that Marx was on a firmer financial footing. The end of his time writing for the New York Daily Tribune and his increased income allowed Marx to concentrate on a large work which had been in the firmament for some time. This would be the major distillation of his political ideas. He spent much time writing it in the reading rooms of the British Museum in London, the archival and library sections of which are the British Library today. It was here that Marx drew up hundreds of pages of notes on all manner of issues relating to class relations and the like. The result would be a 3-volume work published gradually over several decades and entitled Das Kapital, Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, which translates as Capital, a critique of political economy. The first volume of Das Kapital was published in 1867. It was a lengthy work in and of itself, one which runs to 500 to 600 pages in most modern editions. It was then supplemented by Volume 2 and Volume 3, published posthumously in 1885 and 1894 respectively, after Engels finished the 2 texts based on Marx's very extensive notes and drafts. Collectively, the 3 volumes tend to run to over 1,000 pages in modern editions that tried to publish them in 1 volume. and that can only be achieved by using a very small print or synopsizing substantial sections of the text. It is therefore an extremely long work, running upwards of 1,000,000 words in most modern editions if footnotes or endnotes are included. Given its sheer size, there are a great many elements to Das Kapital, far more than with the rather paltry Communist Manifesto. Two key facets of it should be noted. Das Kapital offered the clearest articulation of Marx's views on historical materialism. This is the view of history as primarily being characterized by conflict between different economic classes. This is not an entirely groundbreaking idea today. In the middle of the 19th century, though, it was trailblazing. Up to this time, most historians, or those who deployed historical arguments, tended to assess human history as being about a conflict of different ethnic groups or of empires, kingdoms, and nation-states. Pick up a 19th century European history book and you will invariably be greeted by chapters outlining conflicts between England and France, the German states and the papacy, Spain and Portugal. Kings, queens, lords and popes featured heavily, and religion and territorial power was allegedly what motivated them. Conversely, little was said about what the vast majority of the population of such countries did, and what their motivations were. Marx was writing in reaction to this. He argued that history was basically a clash of different economic classes rather than nation-states. In this reimagining, Western European history in the High Middle Ages was not, for example, a tale of the French and English crowns waging war on one another, but of the French and English nobility collectively oppressing the feudal peasantry. Over time, the relations between economic classes changed, as different technological innovations transformed the modes of production of food and goods. Therefore, Europe's recent history had been tumultuous, and was resulting in class warfare owing to the recent innovations of the Industrial Revolution, ones which were pitting the bourgeoisie, a class that had in turn defeated the old feudal nobility centuries earlier, against the new industrial proletariat. To Marx's mind, historical materialism offered a method of explaining nearly all historical developments. While many people might disagree with the political ends towards which Marx was working in formulating this theory, or argue that he placed too much emphasis on material issues as being the fulcrum on which all historical events pivoted, there is no denying that he contributed to a fundamental re-evaluation of historical methodology, one which highlighted how economic developments and class conflict were just as important as nationalism or the actions of leading rulers and statesmen. This concept of historical materialism is directly related to one of the other key facets of Marxist thought as presented in Das Kapital. It is called the Marxist dialectic, or dialectical materialism. In fashioning this, Marx was responding to the dialectical methods espoused by Hegel decades earlier. The Hegelian dialectic argued that ideas were often in fundamental conflict with each other, but that this tension could result in a more sophisticated outcome. For instance, a person might put forward an idea or thesis concerning a philosophical issue. Then, a second person or group would put forward a counter-argument or antithesis. In many instances, neither would be entirely correct, but the fundamental tension between the two arguments would result in a more evolved synthesis that borrowed from both thesis and antithesis to form a synthesis. The Hegelian concept ultimately has its roots in the philosophical methods of Plato. Marx now borrowed and altered this dialectical approach and injected arguments about political economy and metaphysics into it. What he was arguing was that society and nature had a physical existence beyond the impression of it which human beings form in their mind, and therefore was worth studying independent of individual perceptions of society. In this he was rejecting Hegel's thoughts and a long line of other European philosophers going back to René Descartes, who had founded the Cartesian school of metaphysics in the middle of the 17th century. For Marx, the individual could be ignored to some extent. What was significant within this dialectical method was that economic groups were in tension with one another, leading to changes in the physical world, though ones which were often contradictory or difficult to explain. The Marxist dialectic is one of the more complex elements to Marx's thought in Das Kapital and his political and philosophical outlook more generally. It is also one of the most controversial. Many hold that in placing emphasis on the material world and how it operated, and in rejecting Hegel's Cartesianism, that Marx was essentially rejecting the fundamental value of the individual in society. The argument here is that in stating that the material relations between economic groups in the world and how they relate to nature, rather than individual perceptions of the same, were what was important, Marx was essentially trivializing the value of individuals. It is easy to see why this might be deemed a controversial viewpoint, particularly so when we consider that Joseph Stalin produced a paper entitled Dialectical and Historical Materialism that was first published in 1938 in the midst of the Great Purge that he was inflicting on Russia at the time. The argument could follow that Marx's dialectical reasoning was consequently responsible for the worst excesses of the Soviet Union and other communist regimes in decades to come. Nor is the Marxist dialectic the only thing which has been deemed controversial in Marx's work. His view of historical materialism, while a very useful corrective to the traditional view of history being a clash between kingdoms and nation-states, when overstated, has led to an overt emphasis on class struggles as being behind all historical phenomena. Finally, his advocacy for the communal ownership and management of goods might have been considered utopian by many in the 20th century. But what Marx overlooked was the possibility of authoritarianism being used to achieve this. Marx was not an authoritarian by any stretch of the imagination himself, yet he failed to realize that efforts to put his ideas into practice could result in tyrannical regimes, particularly so if attempted in countries like Russia, which had a centuries-long political culture of autocracy. Practical measures to try and further the communist mission in the real world, and not just on paper, were underway even as Marx was writing up the first volume of Das Kapital in the mid-1860s. In 1864, a coalition of socialist, communist and other left-wing radical groups from around Europe was formed at a meeting in the Queen's Theatre in London on the 28th of September. They called themselves the International Working Men's Association, though today, in communist historiography, this is known as the First International, it being the first entity that claimed to represent communist groups from all over the world. Though in reality, at the time, that meant Europe in practice, as communism had barely spread anywhere else, a few advocates in the Americas being the only major exception. The onus for the gathering was the Poland uprising against Russian rule there in 1863, and the realization that grassroots labor organizations and those that represented groups like the oppressed Polish subjects of the Russian Empire could meet with greater success if they organized themselves on an international scale. By transcending international borders in this way, they could aspire to mimic the revolutions of 1848 one day. Marx was heavily involved in the First International. However, the First International soon descended into conflict, specifically between a more staunchly communist wing led by Marx and an anarchist wing led by the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin, a seminal figure in the history of political anarchism. The dispute came to a head at a conference at The Hague in the Netherlands in 1872, and the First International effectively collapsed over the next few years. A Second International would not emerge until 1889, after Marx's death. The split in the First International was in many ways fueled by the events of 1871. In mid-March of that year, as France, and in particular the city of Paris, tried to recover from the shock of its swift defeat by Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War, radical political groups had seized control of the French capital. The Paris Commune would control the city for 2.5 months before its bloody suppression by the government of the fledgling Third French Republic, resulting in the deaths of anywhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people. The Commune cannot be considered a wholly communist revolution, as the Communards were a loose coalition of political radicals, but it certainly involved communist and radical socialist elements. Marx engaged in a flurry of activity from London when news arrived of what was happening in Paris in March 1871. The treatise that he prepared in response to it was entitled The Civil War in France, though by the time he finished it, the Commune had already been suppressed, and the text needed to be edited to put it into the past tense for publication that summer. We get a sense of how overly optimistic Marx's view of the Commune was from this passage. Wonderful indeed was the change the Commune had wrought in Paris. No longer any trace of the meretricious Paris of the Second Empire. No longer was Paris the rendezvous of British landlords, Irish absentees, American ex-slaveholders and shoddy men, Russian ex-serf owners and Wallachian boyards. No more corpses at the morgue, no nocturnal burglaries, scarcely any robberies. In fact, for the first time since the days of February 1848, the streets of Paris were safe, and that without any police of any kind. Whatever the merits of the Commune may or may not have been, to present Paris as a paragon of peace and safety in the late spring of 1871 stretches credulity. The events of the early 1870s, with the brief possibility of a new revolution in France, and then the gradual collapse of the First International in the years that followed, were the final era of major political involvement by Marx. He turned 60 in 1878, and by then his health was seriously declining. He continued to write, though much of his time was absorbed in preparing the second and third volumes of Das Kapital, 2 works which he never fully completed and brought to publication. Engels would achieve this after his death. A number of his later writings, correspondence and minor publications were of note. For instance, in 1881, he discussed with Vera Sasulich, a Russian communist who is a forgotten but formative figure in the history of the movement in that country, whether Russia could aspire towards communism, the traditional Marxist view being that societies would have to move from feudalism to capitalism, then capitalism to socialism, and from socialism to communism, industrialization being a necessary process in the development of capitalism into socialism. Given future events, it was an interesting correspondence. By then, several thousand copies of Marx's work had been published in Russian, though he would have found the fact that Russia would soon become the epicenter of the communist movement very curious, given that he had envisaged it as a political ideology for countries like England, Germany, or even France that were well along the path of industrialization already and had an urban proletariat to drive the revolution as a result. Karl's wife Jenny died in December 1881. His own health was not good by then, and it declined precipitously thereafter. Indeed, it had never been good. As early as the late 1830s, Marx had been excused from military service in Prussia on the basis of ill health. What exactly was involved is not 100% clear. He may have been suffering from some form of pleurisy even at this early stage. This was compounded by issues brought on by his borderline alcoholism, exacerbated by poor living conditions in London. He did everything wrong from a modern health perspective thereafter, working long hours, having a poor diet, smoking, and then adding sleep aids into the mix when he developed insomnia later in life. He may have had other conditions. Ultimately, it is hard to tell from the limited medical records available. What is clear is that he developed a case of catarrh right at the beginning of 1882 that reduced his ability to breathe properly. His health continued to decline from then onwards, and Marx died in London on the 14th of March 1883 at 64 years of age. He was almost penniless at the time, and friends and political colleagues put some money together to organize for his burial in Highgate Cemetery in the city. The funeral was a very modest affair, attended by Engels and around a dozen other people, hardly a large showing for a figure whose writings would, for better or worse, have an enormous impact on the century that followed his own. Even by the time Marx died in 1883, there had been enormous progress made in reforming the worst elements of the relationship between the business and working classes that had been allowed to develop during the first decades of industrialization. Back in 1847, when he and Engels had been brainstorming what would become the Communist Manifesto, the British government under Lord John Russell introduced the Factories Act of 1847, colloquially known as the 10 Hours Act. This enshrined the principle that women and children should never be required by factory owners and managers to work more than 63 hours per week, an upper limit that was quickly reduced to 58 hours in 1848. This might still seem like a very high number of hours. However, it was the beginning of a process of reform which led to the working conditions of the proletariat improving incrementally over the second half of the 19th century. For a time, governments introduced these measures relatively willingly. Yet workers also began to use their collective bargaining power through trade unions and labour movements late in the century and into the 20th to extract greater concessions from the business classes. It was a time of great conflict, one often marred by violent clashes, like the Homestead Strike in Pennsylvania in the United States in 1892, when the American industrialist Henry Clay Frick brought in strikebreakers to wage war on his own workers. But over time, huge concessions were won in the decades prior to and after Marx's death. Still, Marx would not have been satisfied with this. His observations of industrialization had convinced him that a radical overhaul of the entire system of ownership was needed. Communism, not socialism or labor reform. Many agreed with him. In the course of the 1870s, 1880s and 1890s, many communist movements began to appear in industrialized European countries. Many did not have names like the Communist Party, but instead bore names like the Socialist Workers' Party, yet were still adherents of many of the ideas of Marx and Engels. One such was the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, formed in the city of Minsk in what was then the Russian Empire. It soon split into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, the former of which would launch the October Revolution in Russia in 1917, beginning the ascent to power of the Communist Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The emergence of the Soviet Union would inspire many imitators, and as the First World War came to an end in 1918, communist regimes were briefly established in places like Hungary and several major cities in Germany. Ultimately, it would require the defeat of fascism and the advent of the Cold War from 1945 onwards for communism to emerge as a global force. At the height of the Cold War between the 1960s and 1980s, nearly half of the world's nations purported to be communist states.
Of course, all this raises questions as to the extent to which Marx was responsible for the rise of these authoritarian regimes, many of which committed appalling crimes against their own people, none more so than the Soviet Union and Maoist China, two countries in which tens of millions of people died in man-made famines between the early 1930s and the mid-1960s, and in which state terror devastated entire societies. Some historians suggest that Marx bears some blame for the manner in which his idealistic utopian ideals of collectivism and the ending of private property rights created the conditions for socialist countries descending into authoritarian dystopias. Indeed, it could be said that this is the point at which Marxism and socialism falls apart, as that it is impossible to eliminate private property rights in a population other than with the use of force, as people with private property, which has often been built up over generations, seldom consent to surrendering the fruits of their labors willingly. It has also been stipulated that because of this and the fact that the majority of communist revolutions took place in countries which were previously under autocratic rule, like Russia under the Tsars, that the revolutionary regimes simply replicated and amplified the worst characteristics of the regimes they replaced. There is little doubt that Marx had genuine concern for the quality of the lives of the millions of people who rapid industrialization in the 19th century had thrown into squalor, and that his ideas were intended to give everyone in society enough food and wealth to live on comfortably. He would no doubt have been appalled by the horrific death toll that occurred under the 20th century regimes who adhered to his ideology. However, the question is, do his writings and ideas contain a vital flaw which, if enacted, makes authoritarianism all but certain? Indeed, if one takes even a cursory glimpse at 20th century history, it is difficult to argue with this point. As the saying goes, the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions.
What do you think of Karl Marx? Was he simply a well-meaning socialist reacting to the dreadful industrial squalor of the mid-19th century? Or was he the architect of much of the suffering of the 20th century, whose dream of reshaping society into a fair and equal utopia ended in creating one of the greatest nightmares humanity has ever endured? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.